Chapter 49 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 49. The snow increased all day. When the 6 o'clock whistle blew and the workmen streamed out of the factories, it was a wild waste of winter and storm. The wind had come up, and the light snow arose in the distance like white dancers of death, spinning furiously over the level, then settling into long, grave-like ridges. Ellen glanced into the office as she passed the door, and saw Robert Lloyd talking busily with Flynn and another foreman by the name of Dennison. As she passed, Robert turned with a look as if he had been watching for her, and came forward hastily. "Miss Brewster," he called. Mamie Brady, following close behind, gave Ellen an admonishing nudge. "Boss wants to see you," she whispered loudly. Ellen stopped, and Robert came up. "Please step in here a moment, Miss Brewster," he said, and colored a little. Granville Joy, who was following Ellen, looked keenly at him. Someone sniggered aloud, and a girl said quite audibly, "My land!" Ellen followed Robert into the office, and he bent over her, speaking rapidly in a low voice. "You must not walk home in the snow," he said, "and the cars are not running. You must let me take you. My sleigh is at the door." Ellen turned white. Somehow this protecting care for herself, in the face of all which she had been considering that day, gave her a tremendous shock. She felt at once touched and more indignant than she had ever been in her whole life. She had been half believing that Robert was neglecting her, that he had forgotten her. All day she had been judging his action of cutting the wages of the workmen from her unswerving, childlike, unshadowed point of view, and now this little evidence of humanity towards her, in the face of what she considered wholesale inhumanity towards others, made her at once severe to him and to herself, and she forced back sternly the leap of pleasure and happiness which this thought of her awakened. "No, thank you," she said shortly. "I am much obliged, but I would rather walk." "But you cannot in this storm," pleaded Robert, in a low voice. "Yes, I can. It is no worse for me than for others. There is Maria Atkins. She has been coughing all day." "I will take her too, Ellen. You cannot walk. You must let me take you." "I am much obliged, but I would rather not," replied Ellen, in an icy tone. She looked quite hard in his face. Robert looked at her perplexed. "But it is drifting," he said. "It is no worse for me than for the others." Ellen turned to go. Her attitude of rebuff was unmistakable. Robert colored. "Very well, I will not urge you," he said, coldly. Then he returned to his desk, and Ellen went out. She caught up with Maria Atkins, who was struggling painfully through the drifts, leaning on Abby's arm, and slipped a hand under her thin shoulder. "I expect nothing but she'll get her death out in this storm," grumbled Abby. "What did he want, Ellen?" "Nothing in particular," replied Ellen. Uppermost in her mind at that moment was the charge of cruelty against Robert for not taking her hint as to Maria. "He can ask me to ride because he has amused himself with me, but as for taking this poor girl, whom he does not love, when it may mean life or death to her, he did not think seriously of doing that for a moment," she thought. Maria was coughing, although she strove hard to smother the coughs. Granville Joy, who was plodding ahead, turned and waited until they came up. "You had better let me carry you, Maria," he said jocularly, but his honest eyes were full of concern. "He is enough sight kinder than Robert Lloyd," thought Ellen. "He has a better heart." And then the splendid Lloyd sleigh came up behind them and stopped, tilting to a drift. Robert, in his fur-lined coat, sprang out and went up to Maria. "Please let me take you home," he said kindly. "You have a cold, and this storm is too severe for you to be out. Please let me take you home." Maria looked at him, fairly gasping with astonishment. She tried to speak, but a cough choked her. "You had better go if Mr. Lloyd will take you," Abby said, decisively. "Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. She isn't fit to be out." She urged her sister towards the sleigh, and Robert assisted her into the fur-lined nest. "I can sit with the driver," said Robert to Abby, "if you will come with your sister." "No, thank you," replied Abby. "I am able to walk, but I will be much obliged if you will take Maria home." Robert sprang in beside Maria, and the sleigh slid out of sight. "I never," said Abby. Ellen said nothing, but plodded on, her eyes fixed on the snowy track. "I am glad she had a chance to ride," said Granville Joy, in a tentative voice. He looked uneasily at Ellen. "It beats the Dutch," said Abby. She also regarded Ellen with sympathy and perplexity. When they reached the street where she lived, up which the sleigh had disappeared, she let Granville go on ahead, and she spoke to Ellen in a low tone. "Why didn't he ask you?" she said. "He did," replied Ellen. "In the office?" "Yes." "And you wouldn't?" "No." "Why not?" "I don't care to accept favors from a man who oppresses all my friends." "He was good to take in Maria," said Abby, in a perplexed voice. "His uncle would never have thought of it." Ellen made no reply. She stood still in the drifting snow, with her mouth shut hard. "You feel as if this cutting wages was a pretty hard thing?" said Abby. "Yes, I do." "Well, so do I. I wonder what they will do about it. I don't know how the men feel. Somehow folks can't seem to think or plan much in a storm like this. There's the sleigh coming back." "Good night," Ellen said, hurriedly, and trudged on as fast as she was able in order not to have the Lloyd sleigh pass her. It had to turn after reaching the end of the street. Ellen caught up with Granville Joy. Robert, glancing over the waving fringe of fur tails, saw, disappearing in the pale gleam of the electric light, the two dim figures veiled by the drifting snow. He thought to himself, with a sharp pain, that perhaps, after all, Granville Joy was the reason for her rebuff. It never occurred to him that his action in cutting the wages could have anything to do with it. Ellen went along with Granville, who was anxious to offer her his arm, but did not quite dare. He kept thrusting out an elbow in her direction, and an inarticulate invitation died in his throat. Finally, when they reached an unusually high drift of snow, he plucked up sufficient courage. "Take my arm, won't you?" he said, with a pitiful attempt at ease, then stared as if he had been shot, at Ellen's reply. "No, thank you," she said. "I think it is easier to walk alone in snow like this." "Maybe it is," assented Granville, dejectedly. He walked on, scuffling as hard as he could to make a path for Ellen with the patient faithfulness of a dog. "What are you going to do about the cut in wages?" Ellen asked, presently. Granville started. The sudden transition from personalities to generalities confused him. "What?" he said. Ellen repeated her question. "I don't know," said Granville. "I don't think the boys have made up their minds. I don't know what they will do. They have been weeding out union men. I suppose the union would have something to say about it, otherwise I don't know what we will do." "I shouldn't think there would be very much doubt as to what to do," said Ellen. Granville stared at her over his shoulder in a perplexed, admiring fashion. "You mean?" he asked. "I shouldn't think there would be any doubt." "Well, I don't know. It is a pretty serious thing to get out of work in midwinter for a good many of us, and as long as the union isn't in control, other men can come in. I don't know." "I know," said Ellen. "You mean?" "I mean that I do not think it right, that it is unjust, and I believe in resisting injustice." "Men have resisted injustice ever since the creation," said Granville, in a bitter voice. "Well, resistance can continue as long as life lasts," returned Ellen. Just then came a fiercer blast than ever, laden with a stinging volley of snow, and seemed to sweep the words from the girl's mouth. She bent before it involuntarily, and the conviction forced itself upon her that, after all, resistance to injustice might be as futile as resistance to storm, that injustice might be one of the primal forces of the world, and one of the conditions of its endurance, and yet with the conviction came the renewed resolution to resist. What can poor men do against capital, "Unless they are backed up by some labor organization?" asked Granville. "And I don't believe there are a dozen in the factory who belong to the union. There has been an understanding, without his ever saying so that I know of, that the old boss didn't approve of it. So lots of us kept out of it. We wanted work so bad. What can we do against such odds?" "When right is on your side, you have all the odds," said Ellen, looking back over her snow powdered shoulder. "Then you would strike?" "I wouldn't submit." "Well, I don't know how the boys feel," said Granville. "I suppose we'll have to talk it over." "I shouldn't need to talk it over," said Ellen. "You've gone past your house, Granville." "I ain't going to let you go home alone in such a storm as this," said Granville, in a tender voice, which he tried to make facetious. "I wouldn't let any girl go home alone in such a storm." Ellen stopped short. "I don't want you to go home with me, thank you, Granville," she said. "Your mother will have supper ready, and I can go just as well alone." "Ellen, I won't let you go alone," said the young man, as a wilder gust came. "Suppose you should fall down?" "Fall down?" repeated Ellen, with a laugh, but her regard of the young man, in spite of her rebuff, was tender. He touched her with his unfailing devotion. The heavy trudging by her side of this poor man meant, she told herself, much more than the invitation of the rich one to ride behind his bays in his luxurious sleigh. This meant the very bone and sinew of love. She held out her little mittened hand to him. "Good night, Granville," she said. Granville caught it eagerly. "Oh, Ellen," he murmured. But she withdrew her hand quickly. "We have always been good friends, and we will always be," said she, and her tone was unmistakable. The young man shrank back. "Yes, we always will, Ellen," he said, in a faithful voice, with a note of pain in it. "Good night," said Ellen again. "Good night," responded Granville, and turned his plodding back on the girl and retraced his laborious steps towards his own home, which he had just passed. There come times for all souls when the broad light of the path of humanity seems to pale to insignificance before the intensity of the one little searchlight of personality. Granville Joy felt as if the eternal problem of the rich and poor, of labor and capital, of justice and equality, was as nothing before the desire of his heart for that one girl who was disappearing from his sight behind the veil of virgin snow. Chapter 49. Chapter 50 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 50. When Ellen came in sight of her house that night, she saw her father's bent figure moving down the path with sidewise motions of a broom. He had been out at short intervals all the afternoon, that she should not have to wade through drifts to the door. The electric light shone full on this narrow, cleared track and the toiling figure. "Hullo, father," Ellen called out. Andrew turned, and his face lit with love and welcome and solicitude. "Be ye dreadful snowy?" he asked. "Oh, no, father, not very." "It's an awful storm." "Pretty bad, but I got along all right. The snow plow has been out." "Wait a minute till I get this swept," said Andrew, sweeping violently before her. "You needn't have bothered, father," said Ellen. "I ain't anything else to do," replied Andrew, in a sad voice. "There's mother watching," said Ellen. "Yes, she's been digging at them wrappers all day." "I suppose she has," Ellen returned in a bitter tone. Her father stared at her. Ellen never spoke like that. For the first time she echoed him and her mother. Something like terror came over him at the sound of that familiar note of his own life from his younger one. He seemed to realize dimly that a taint of his nature had descended upon his child. When Ellen entered the house, the warm air was full of savory odors, of toast and tea and cooking meat and vegetables. "You'd better go right upstairs and put on a dry dress, Ellen," said Fanny. I put your blue one out on your bed, and your shoes are warming by the sitting room stove. I've been worrying as to how you were going to get home all day." Then she stopped short as she caught sight of Ellen's face. "What on earth is the matter, Ellen Brewster?" she said. "Nothing," said Ellen. "Why?" "You look queer. Has anything happened?" "Yes, something has happened." "What?" Andrew turned pale. He stood in the entry with his snowy broom in hand, staring from one to the other. "Nothing that you need worry about," said Ellen. "I'll tell you when I get my dress changed." Ellen pulled off her rubbers and went upstairs to her chamber. Fanny and Andrew stood looking at each other. "You don't suppose," whispered Andrew. "Suppose what?" responded Fanny sharply. They continued to look at each other. Fanny answered Andrew as if he had spoken with that jealous pride for her girl's self-respect which possessed her even before the girl's father. "Land, it ain't that," said she. "You wouldn't catch Ellen looking as if anything had come across her for such a thing as that." "No, I suppose she wouldn't," said Andrew. He actually blushed before his wife's eyes. That afternoon Mrs. Wetherhead had been in and told Fanny that she had heard that Robert Lloyd was to be married to Maud Hemingway, and both Andrew and Fanny had thought of that as the cause of Ellen's changed face. "You'd better take that broom out into the shed and get the snow off yourself, and come in and shut the door," Fanny said, shortly. "You're colding the house all off, and Amabel has got a cold, and she's sitting right in the draught." "All right," replied Andrew, meekly, though Fanny had herself been holding the sitting room door open. In those days Andrew felt below his moral stature as head of the house, actually looking at Fanny, who was earning her small share towards the daily bread. She seemed to him much taller than he, though she was a head shorter. He thought so little of himself, he seemed to see himself as through the wrong end of a telescope. Fanny went into the sitting room and shut the door with a bang. Amabel did not look up from her book. She was reading a library book much beyond her years, and sniffing pathetically with her cold. Amabel had begun to discover an omnivorous taste for books, which stuck at nothing. She understood not more than half of what she read, but seemed to relish it like indigestible food. When Ellen came downstairs and sat beside the coal stove to change her shoes, she looked at the book which Amabel was reading. "You ought not to read that book, dear," she said. "Let Ellen get you a better one for a little girl to morrow." But Amabel, without paying the slightest heed to Ellen's words, looked up at her with amazement, as Andrew and Fanny had done. "What's the matter, Ellen?" she asked, in her little hoarse voice. Fanny and Andrew, who had just entered, stood waiting. Ellen bent over her shoe, drawing in the strings firmly and evenly. "Mr. Lloyd has reduced the wage list," she said. "How much?" asked Andrew in a hoarse voice. 10%. There was a dead silence. Andrew and Fanny looked at Ellen like people who are uncertain of their next move. Amabel stared from one to the other with her weak, watery eyes. Ellen continued to lace her shoes. "What do you think about it, Ellen?" asked Andrew, almost timidly. "I know of only one thing to think," replied Ellen, in a dogged voice. As she spoke she pulled the tag off a shoestring, because it would not go through the eyelet. "What is that?" asked Fanny, in a hard voice. "I think it is cruelty and tyranny," said Ellen, pulling the rough end of the string through the eyelet. "I suppose the times are pretty hard," ventured Andrew, but Ellen cut him short. "Robert Lloyd has $500,000 which has been accumulated by the labor of poor men in prosperous times," said she, with her childlike severity and pitilessness. "There is no question about the matter." Then Fanny flung all self-interest to the wind and was at her daughter's side like a whirlwind. The fact that the two were of one blood was never so strongly evident. Red spots glowed in the elder woman's cheeks, and her black eyes blazed. "Ellen's right," said she. "She's right. For a man worth $500,000 to cut down the wages of poor, hard working folks in midwinter is cruelty. I don't care who does it." "Yes, it is," said Ellen. Fanny opened her mouth to tell Ellen of the rumor concerning Robert's engagement to Maud Hemingway. Then she refrained, for some reason which she could not analyze. In her heart she did not believe the report to be true, and considered the telling of it a slight to Ellen, but it influenced her in her indignation against Robert for the wage cutting. "What are they going to do?" asked Andrew. "I don't know," replied Ellen. "Did he, young Lloyd, talk to the men?" "No. Notices were tacked up all over the shop." "That was the way his uncle would have done," said Andrew, in a curious voice of bitterness and respect. "So you don't know what they are going to do?" said Fanny. "No." "Well, I know what I would," said Fanny. "I never would give in if I starved. Never." Chapter 50. Chapter 51 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 51. When Ellen started for the factory the next morning, the storm had not ceased. The roads were very heavy, although the snowplow had been out at intervals all night, and there was a struggling line of shoveling men along the car track, but the cars were still unable to penetrate the drifts. When Ellen passed her grandmother's house, the old woman tapped sharply on the window and motioned her back frantically with one bony hand. The window was frozen to the sill with the snow, and she could not raise it. Ellen shook her head, smiling. Her grandmother continued to wave her back, the lines of forbidding anxiety in her old face as strongly marked as an etching in the window frame. This love, which had at once coerced and fondled the girl since her birth, was very precious to her. This protection, which she was forced to repel, smote her like pain. "Poor old grandmother," she thought. "There she will worry about me all day because I have gone out in the storm." She turned back and waved her hand and nodded laughingly, but the old woman continued that anxiously imperative backward motion until Ellen was out of sight. Ellen walked in the car track, as did everybody else, that being better cleared than the rest of the road. She was astonished that she heard nothing of the cut in wages from the men. There seemed to be no excitement at all. They merely trudged heavily along, their whitening bodies bent before the storm. There was an unusual doggedness about this march to the factory this morning, but that was all. Ellen returned the muttered greeting of several, and walked along in silence with the rest. Even when Abby Atkins joined her, there was little said. Ellen asked for Maria, and Abby replied that she had taken more cold yesterday, and could not speak aloud, then relapsed into silence, making her way through the snow with a sort of taciturn endurance. Ellen looked at the struggling procession of which she was a part, all slanting with the slant of the storm, and a fancy seized her that rebellion and resistance were hopeless, that those parallel lines of yielding to the onslaughts of fate were as inevitable as life itself, one of its conditions. Men could not help walking that way when the bitter storm wind was blowing. They could not help living that way when fate was in array against their progress. Then, thinking so, a mightier spirit of revolt than she had ever known awoke within her. She, as she walked, straightened herself. She leaned not one whit before the drive of the storm. She advanced with no yielding in her, her brave face looking ahead through the white blur of snow with a confidence which was almost exultation. "What do you think the men will do?" she said to Abby when they came in sight of Lloyd's, shaggy with fringes and wreaths and overhanging shelvings of snow, roaring with machinery, with a steady stream of labor pouring in the door. "Do?" repeated Abby, almost listlessly. "Do about what?" "About the cut in wages." Abby turned on her with sudden fire. "Oh, my God! What can they do, Ellen Brewster?" she demanded. "Haven't they got to live? Hasn't Lloyd got it all his own way? How are men to live in weather like this without work? Bread without butter is better than none at all, and life at any cost is better than death for them you love. What can they do?" "It seems to me there is only one thing to do," replied Ellen. Abby stared at her wonderingly. "You don't mean," she said, as they climbed up the stairs. "I mean I would do anything, at whatever cost to myself, to defeat injustice," said Ellen in a loud, clear voice. Several men turned and looked back at her and laughed bitterly. "It's easy talking," said one to another. "That's so," returned the other. The people all settled to their work as usual. One of the foremen, Dennison, who was anxious to curry favor with his employer, reported to him in an undertone in the office that everything was quiet. Robert nodded easily. He had not anticipated anything else. In the course of the morning he looked into the room where Ellen was employed, and saw with relief and concern her fair head before her machine. It seemed to him that he could not bear it one instant longer to have her working in this fashion, that he must lift her out of it. He still tingled with his rebuff of the night before, but he had never loved her so well, for the idea that the cut in wages affected her relation to him never occurred to him. As he walked through the room, none of the workers seemed to notice him, but worked with renewed energy. He might have been invisible for all the attention he seemed to excite. He looked with covert tenderness at the back of Ellen's head, and passed on. He reflected that he had adopted the measure of wage cutting with no difficulty whatever. "All it needs is a little firmness," he thought, with a boyish complacency in his own methods. "Now I can keep on with the factory, and no turning the poor people adrift in midwinter." At noon Robert put on his fur-lined coat and left the factory, springing into the sleigh, which had drawn up before the door with a flurry of bells. He had an errand in the next town that afternoon, and was not going to return. When the sleigh had slid swiftly out of sight through the storm, which was lightening a little, the people in the office turned to one another with a curious expression of liberty, but even then little was said. Nellie Stone was at the desk eating her luncheon. Ed Flynn and Dennison and one of the lasters, who had looked in and then stepped in when he saw Lloyd was gone, were there. The laster, who was young and coarsely handsome, had an admiration for the pretty girl at the desk. Presently she addressed him with her mouth full of apple pie. "Say, George, what are you fellows going to do?" she asked. Dennison glanced keenly from one to the other. Flynn shrugged his shoulders and looked out of the window. "Looks as if it were clearing up," he remarked. "What are you going to do?" asked Nellie Stone again, with a coquettish flirt of her blond fluff of hair. "Grin and bear it, I s'pose," replied the young laster, with an adoring look at her. "My land! Grin and bear a cut of 10%. Well, I don't think you've got much spunk, I must say. Why don't you strike?" "Who's going to feed us?" replied the laster, in a tender voice. "Feed you? Oh, you don't want much to eat. Join the union. It's ridiculous so few of the men in Lloyd's belong to it, anyway, and then the union will feed you, won't it?" "The union did not do what it promised in the Scarborough strike," interposed Dennison curtly. "Oh, we all know where you are, Frank Dennison," said the girl, with a soft roll of her blue eyes. "Besides, it's easy to talk when you aren't hit. Your wages aren't cut. But here is George May here. He's in a different box." "He's got nobody dependent on him, anyway," said Flynn. "If I wasn't going to get married, I'd strike," cried the young man, with a fervent glance at the girl. She colored, half pleased, half angry, and the other men chuckled. She took another bite of pie to conceal her confusion. She preferred Flynn to the laster, and while she was not averse to proving to the former the triumph of her charms over another man, did not like too much concessions. "You'd better go and eat your dinner, George May," she said, in her sweet, shrill voice. "First thing you know, the whistle will blow. Here's yours, Ed." With that she pulled out a leather bag from under the desk, where she had volunteered to place it for warmth and safety against the coil of steam pipes. "I don't believe your coffee is very cold, Ed," said she. The laster glared from one to the other jealously. Dennison went towards a shelf where he had stored away his luncheon, when he stopped suddenly and listened, as did the others. There came a great uproar of applause from the next room beyond. Then it subsided, and a girl's clear, loud voice was heard. "What is going on?" cried Nellie Stone. She jumped up and ran to the door, still eating her pie, and the men followed her. At the end of one of the workrooms, backed against a snowy window, clung about with shreds of the driving storm, stood Ellen Brewster, with some other girls around her and a few men on the outskirts, and a steady, curious movement of all the other workmen towards her, as of iron fillings toward a magnet, and she was talking. Her voice was quite audible all over the great room. It was low-pitched, but had a wonderful carrying quality, and there was something marvelous in its absolute confidence. "If you men will do nothing and say nothing, it is time for a girl to say and act," she proclaimed. "I did not dream for a minute that you would yield to this cut in wages. Why should you have your wages cut?" "The times are pretty hard," said a doubtful voice among her auditors. "What if the times are hard? What is that to you? Have you made them hard? It is the great capitalists who have made them hard by shifting the wealth too much to one side. They are the ones who should suffer, not you. What have you done except come here morning after morning, in cold or heat, rain or shine, and work with all your strength? They who have precipitated the hard times are the ones who should bear the brunt of them. Your work is the same now as it was then. The strain on your flesh and blood and muscles is the same. Your pay should be the same." "That's so," said Abby Atkins in a reluctant, surly fashion. "That's so," said another girl, and another. Then there was a fusillade of hand claps started by the girls, and somewhat feebly echoed by the men. One or two men looked rather uneasily back towards Dennison and Flynn, and two more foremen who had come forward. "It ain't as though we had something to fall back on," said a man's grumbling voice. "It's easy to talk when you ain't got a wife and 5 children dependent on you." "That's so," said another man, doggedly. "That has nothing to do with it," said Ellen, firmly. "We can all club together and keep the wolf from the door for those who are hardest pressed for a while, and as for me, if I were a man—" She paused a minute. When she spoke again her voice was full of childlike enthusiasm. It seemed to ring like a song. "If I were a man," said she, "I would go out in the street and dig. I would beg. I would steal before I would yield. I, a free man in a free country, to tyranny like this." There was a great round of applause at that. Dennison scowled and said something in a low voice to another foreman at his side. Flynn laughed, with a perplexed, admiring look at Ellen. "The question is," said Tom Peel, slouching on the outskirts of the throng, and speaking in an imperturbable, compelling, drawling voice, "whether the free men in the free country are going to kick themselves free, or into tighter places by kicking. If you have got to stop to count the cost of bravery and standing up for your rights, there would be no bravery in the world," returned Ellen, with disdain. "Oh, I am ready to kick," said Peel, with his mask-like smile. "So am I," said Granville Joy, in a loud voice. Amos Lee came rushing through the crowd to Ellen's side. He had been eating his dinner in another room, and had just heard what was going on. He opened his mouth with a motion as of letting loose a flood of ranting, but somebody interposed. John Sargent, bulky and irresistible in his steady resolution, put him aside and stood before him. "Look here," he said to them all, "there may be truth in what Miss Brewster says, but we must not act hastily. There is too much at stake. Let us appoint a committee and go to see Mr. Lloyd this evening and remonstrate on the cutting of the wages." He turned to Ellen in a kindly, half paternal fashion. "Don't you see it would be better?" he said. She looked at him doubtfully, her cheeks glowing, her eyes like stars. She was freedom and youth incarnate, and rebellious against all which she conceived as wrong and tyrannical. She could hardly admit, in her fire of enthusiasm, of pure indignation, of any compromise or arbitration. All the griefs of her short life, she had told herself, were directly traceable to the wrongs of the system of labor and capital, and were awakening within her as freshly as if they had just happened. She remembered her father, exiled in his prime from his place in the working world by this system of arbitrary employment. She remembered her aunt in the asylum, poor little Amabel, her own mother, toiling beyond her strength on underpaid work, Maria coughing her life away. She remembered her own life twisted into another track from the one which she should have followed, and there was for the time very little reason or justice in her. That injustice which will arise to meet its kind in equal combat had arisen in her heart. Still, she had yielded. "Perhaps you are right," she said to Sargent. She had always liked John Sargent, and she respected him. "I am sure it is the best course," he said to her, still in that low, confidential voice. It ended in a committee of four: John Sargent, Amos Lee, Tom Peel, and one of the older Lasters, a very respectable man, a deacon in the Baptist church, being appointed to wait on Robert Lloyd that evening. When the 1 o'clock whistle blew, Ellen went back to her machine. She was very pale, but she was conscious of a curious steadiness of all her nerves. Abby leaned towards her and spoke low in the roar of wheels. "I'll back you up, if I die for it," she said. But Sadie Peel, on the other side, spoke quite openly, with a laugh and shrug of her shoulders. "Land," she said, "father'll be with you. He's bound to strike. He struck when he was in McGuire's. Catch father giving up anything. But as for me, I wish you'd all slow up and stick to work, if you do get a little less. If we quit work, I can't have a nearseal cape, and I've set my heart on a nearseal cape this winter." End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 52. Ellen resolved that she would say as little as possible about the trouble at home that night. She did not wish her parents to worry over it until it was settled in one way or another. When her mother asked what they had done about the wage cutting, she replied that a committee had been appointed to wait on Mr. Lloyd that evening and talk it over with him. Then she said nothing more. "He won't give in if he's like his uncle," said Fanny. Ellen went on eating her supper in silence. Her father glanced at her with sharp solicitude. "Maybe he will," said he. "No, he won't," returned Fanny. Ellen was very pale and her eyes were bright. After supper she went to the window and pressed her face against the glass, shielding her eyes from the indoor light, and saw that the storm had quite ceased. The stars were shining and the white boughs of the trees lashing about in the northwest wind. She went into the entry where she had hung her hat and coat, and began putting them on. "Where are you going, Ellen?" asked her mother. "Just down to Abby's a minute." "You don't mean to say you're going out again in this snow, Ellen Brewster? I should think you were crazy." When Fanny said crazy, she suddenly started and shuddered as if she had struck herself. She thought of Eva. Always the possibility of a like doom was in her mind. "It has stopped snowing, mother," Ellen said. "Stopped snowing? What if it has? The roads ain't cleared. You can't get down to Abby Atkins without getting wet up to your knees. I should think if you got into the house after such a storm, you'd have sense enough to stay in. I've worried just about enough." Ellen took off her coat and hat and hung them up again. "Well, I won't go if you feel so, mother," she said patiently. It seems as if you might get along without seeing Abby Atkins till tomorrow morning, when you'd see her only an hour ago," Fanny went on, in the high, nagging tone which she often adopted with those whom she loved the dearest. "Yes, I can," said Ellen. It seemed to her that she must see somebody with whom she could talk about the trouble in the factory, but she yielded. There was always with the girl a perfect surface docility, as that she seemed to have no resistance but a little way down with a rock bed of firmness. She lighted her lamp and took her library book and went upstairs to bed to read. But she could not read, and she could not sleep when she had put aside her book and extinguished her lamp. She could think of nothing except Robert, and what he would say to the committee. She lay awake all night thinking of it. Ellen was a girl who was capable of the most devoted love, and the most intense dissent and indignation towards the same person. She could love in spite of faults, and she could see faults in spite of love. She thought of Robert Lloyd as of the one human soul whom she loved best out of the whole world, whom she put before everybody else, even her own self, and she also thought of him with a wrath which was pitiless and uncompromising, and which seemed to tear her own heart to pieces, for one cannot be wroth with love without a setback of torture. "If he does not give in and raise the wages, I shall hate him," thought Ellen, and her heart stung her as if at the touch of a hot iron, and then she could have struck herself for the supposition that he would not give in. He must, she told herself with a great fervor of love. He must. But when she went down to breakfast the next morning, her mother stared at her sharply. "Ellen Brewster, what is the matter with you?" she cried. "Nothing. Why?" "Nothing? You look like a ghost." "I feel perfectly well," said Ellen. She made an effort to eat as much breakfast as usual in order that her mother should not suspect that she was troubled. When at last she set out for the factory, in the early morning dusk, she was chilled and trembling with excitement. The storm had quite ceased, and there was a pale rose and violet dawn light in the east, and presently came effects like golden feathered shafts shooting over the sky. The road was alive with shoveling men. Construction cars of the railroad company were laboring back and forth to clear the tracks. Householders were making their way from their doors to their gates, clearing their paths, lifting up the snow in great glittering blue white blocks on their clumsy shovels. Everywhere were the factory employees hastening to their labor. The snow was dropping from the overladen tree branches in great blobs. There was an incessant shrill chatter of people and occasional shouts. It was the rally of mankind after a defeat by a primitive force of nature. It was the eternal reassertion of life and a higher organization over the elemental. Men who had walked doggedly the morning before now moved with a spring of alacrity, although the road was very heavy. There was a new light in their eyes. Their cheeks glowed. Ellen had no doubt whatever that if Robert Lloyd had not yielded, the attitude of the employees of Lloyd's would be one of resistance. She herself seemed to breathe in resistance to tyranny, and strength for the right in every breath of the clear, crisp morning air. She felt as if she could trample on herself and her own weakness, for the sake of justice and the inalienable good of her kind, with as little hesitation as she trampled on the creaking snow. Yet she trembled with that deadly chill before a sense of impending fate. When she returned the salutations of her friends on the road, she felt that her lips were stiff. "You look dreadful queer, Ellen," Abby Atkins said, anxiously, when she joined her. Maria also was out that morning. "Have you heard what they are going to do?" Ellen asked, in a sort of breathless fashion. "You mean about the wage cutting? Don't look so, Ellen." Maria pressed close to Ellen and slid her thin arm through hers. "Yes," said Ellen. "What did John Sargent say when he got home last night?" Abby hesitated a second, looking doubtfully at Ellen. "I don't see that there is any need for you to take all this so much to heart," she said. "What did he say?" "Well," Abby replied, reluctantly, I believe Mr. Lloyd wouldn't give in. Ellen Brewster, for heaven's sake, don't look so." Ellen walked on, her head high, her face as white as death. Maria clung closely to her, her own lips quivering. "What are the men going to do, do you think?" asked Ellen, presently, in a low voice. "I don't know," replied Abby. "John Sargent seems to think they'll give in. He says he doesn't know what else they can do. The times are hard. I believe Amos Lee and Tom Peel are for striking, but he says he doesn't believe the men will support them. The amount of it all is, a man with money has got it all his own way. It's like fighting with bare hands to oppose him, and getting yourself cut, and not hurting him at all. He's got all the weapons. We simply can't go without work all winter. It is better to do with less than with nothing at all. What can a man like Willie Jones do if he hasn't any work? He and his mother would actually suffer. What could we do?" "I don't think we ought to think so much about that," said Ellen. "What do you think we ought to think about, for goodness' sake?" "Whether we are doing right or not, whether we are furthering the cause of justice and humanity, or hindering it, whether it is for good in the long run or not. There have always been martyrs. I don't see why it is any harder for us to be martyrs than for those we read about." Sadie Peel came pressing up behind eagerly, her cheeks glowing, holding up her dress and displaying a cheap red petticoat. "Ellen Brewster," she exclaimed, "if you dare say anything more to day I'm going to talk. Father is tearing, though he goes around looking as if he wouldn't jump at a cannon ball. Do, for heaven's sake, keep still, and if you can't get what you want, take what you can get. I ain't going to be cheated out of my nearseal cape, nohow." "Sadie Peel, you make me tired," cried Abby Atkins. "I don't say that I'm striking, but I'd strike for all a nearseal cape. I'm ashamed of you." "I don't care if you be," said the girl, tossing her head. "A nearseal cape means as much to me as some other things to you. I want Ellen Brewster to hold her tongue." "Ellen Brewster will hold her tongue or not, just as she has a mind to," responded Abby, with a snap. She did not like Sadie Peel. "Oh, stick up for her if you want to, and get us all into trouble." "I shall stick up for her, you can be mighty sure of that," declared Abby. Ellen walked on as if she heard nothing of it at all, with little Maria clinging closely to her. Robert Lloyd got out of his sleigh and went upstairs just before they reached the factory, and she heard a very low, subdued mutter of execration. "They don't mean to strike," she told herself. "They mean to submit." All went to their tasks as usual. In a minute after the whistle blew, the great pile was in the full hum of labor. Ellen stood for a few moments at her machine, then she left it deliberately, and made her way down the long room to where John Sargent stood at his bench, cutting shoes, with a swift faithfulness born of long practice. She pressed close to him, while the men around stared. "What is going to be done?" she asked in a low voice. Sargent turned and looked at her in a troubled fashion, and spoke in a pacific, soothing tone, as her father might have done. He was much older than Ellen. "Now look here, child," he said. "I don't dare take the responsibility of urging all these men into starvation this kind of weather. The times are hard. Lloyd has some reason." Ellen walked away from him swiftly, and went to the row of lasting machines where Amos Lee and Tom Peel stood. She walked up to them and spoke in a loud, clear voice. "You are not going to give in?" said she. "You don't mean to give in?" Lee turned and gave her one stare, and left his machine. "Not another stitch of work will I do under this new wage list, so help me God," he proclaimed. Tom Peel stood for a second like an automaton, staring at them both. Then he turned back to his post. "I'm with you," he said. The lasters, for some occult reason, were always the most turbulent element in Lloyd's. In less than 3 minutes the enthusiasm of revolt had spread, and every laster had left his machine. In a half hour more There was an exodus of workmen from Lloyd's. There were very few left in the factory. Among them were John Sargent, the laster, who was a deacon and had formed one of the consulting committee, Sadie Peel, who wanted her nearseal cape, and Mamie Brady, who would do nothing which she thought would displease the foreman, Flynn. "If father's mind to be such a fool, it's no reason why I should," said Sadie Peel, stitching determinedly away. Mamie Brady looked at Flynn, when he came up to her, with a gentle, wheedling smile. There was no one near, and she fancied that he might steal a kiss. But instead he looked at her, frowning. "No use your tying away any longer, Mamie," he said. "The strike's on." Chapter 52. Chapter 53 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 53. That was one of the strangest days which Ellen had ever passed. The enforced idleness gave her an indefinite sense of guilt. She tried to assist her mother about the household tasks. Then she tried to sew on the wrappers, but she was awkward about it from long disuse. "Do take your book and sit down and read and rest a little, now you've got a chance," said Fanny, with sharp solicitude. She said never one word concerning it to Ellen, but all the time she thought how Ellen had probably lost her lover. It was really doubtful which suffered the more that day, the mother or the daughter. Fanny, entirely faithful to her own husband, had yet that strange vicarious affection for her daughter's lover, and a realization of her state of mind, of which a mother alone is capable. It is like a cord of birth which is never severed. Not one shadow of sad reflection passed over the bright, enthusiastic face of the girl, but was passed on, as if driven by some wind of spirit, over the face of the older woman. She reflected Ellen entirely. As for Andrew, his anxiety was as tender and less subtle. He did not understand so clearly, but he suffered more. He was clumsy with this mystery of womanhood, but he was unremitting in his efforts to do something for the girl. Once he tiptoed up to Fanny and whispered, when Ellen was in the next room, that he hoped she hadn't made any mistake, that it seemed to him she looked pretty pale. "Mistake!" cried Fanny, tossing her head, and staring at him proudly. "Haven't you got any spirit? And you a man, Andrew Brewster?" "I ain't thinking about myself," said Andrew. And he was quite right. Andrew, left to himself and his purely selfish interests, could have struck with the foremost. He would never have considered himself when it came to a question of a conscientious struggle against injustice, though he was so prone to look upon both sides of an argument that his decision would have been necessarily slow. But here was Ellen to consider, and she was more than himself. While he had been, in the depths of his heart, fiercely jealous of Robert Lloyd, yet the suspicion that his girl might suffer because of her renunciation of him hurt him to the quick. Ellen had told him all she had done in the interests of the strike, and he had no doubt that her action would effectually put an end to all possible relations between the two. He tried to imagine how a girl would feel, and being a man, and measuring all passion by the strength of his own, he exaggerated her suffering. He could eat nothing, and looked haggard. He remained out of doors the greater part of the day. After he had cleared his own paths, he secured a job clearing some for a more prosperous neighbor. Andrew, in those days, grasped eagerly at any little job which could bring him in a few pennies. He worked until dark, and when he went home he saw with a great throb of excitement the Lloyd sleigh waiting before his door. Robert had heard from Dennison of Ellen's attitude about the strike. He had been incredulous at first, as indeed he had been incredulous about the strike. He had looked out of the office window with the gaze of one who does not believe what he sees when he had heard that retreating tramp of the workmen on the stairs. "What does all this mean?" he said to Dennison, who entered, pale to his lips. "It means a strike," replied Dennison. Nellie Stone rolled her pretty eyes around at the two men from under her fluff of blond hair. Flynn came in and stood in a curious, noncommittal attitude. "A strike?" repeated Robert, vaguely. "What for?" It seemed incredible that he should ask, but he did. The calm masterfulness of his uncle, which could not even imagine opposition, had apparently descended upon him. Both foremen stared at him. Nellie Stone smiled a little covertly. "Why, you know you had a committee wait upon you last night, Mr. Lloyd," replied Dennison. Flynn looked out of the window at the retreating throngs of workmen and gave a whistle under his breath. "Have they struck because of the wage cutting?" asked Robert, in a curious, boyish, incredulous, aggrieved tone. Then, all at once, he colored violently. "Let them strike, then!" he cried. He threw himself into a chair and took up the morning paper, with its glaring headlines about the unprecedented storm, as if nothing had happened. Nellie Stone, after a sly wink at Flynn, which he did not return, began writing again. Flynn went out, and Dennison remained, standing in a rather helpless attitude. A strike in Lloyd's was unprecedented, but this manner of receiving the news was more unprecedented still. The proprietor was apparently reading the morning paper with much interest, when two more foremen, heads of other departments, came hurrying in. "I have heard already," said Robert, in a response to their gasped information. Then he turned another page of the paper. "What's to be done, sir?" said one of the newcomers, after a prolonged stare at his companion and Dennison. He was a spare man, with a fierce glimmer of blue eyes under bent brows. "Let them strike if they want to," replied Robert. It was in his mind to explain at length to these men his reasons for cutting the wages, for his own attitude, as he knew it himself, was entirely reasonable. But the pride of a proud family was up in him. "The strike would never have been on, for the men went to work quietly enough, if it hadn't been for that Brewster girl," Dennison said presently, but rather doubtfully. He was not quite sure how the information would be received. Robert dropped his paper and stared at him with angry incredulity. "What are you talking about?" he said. "What had Miss Brewster to do with it?" He said "Miss Brewster" with a meaning emphasis of respect, and Dennison was quick to adopt the hint. "Oh, nothing," he replied uneasily, "only she talked with them." "You mean that Miss Brewster talked to the men?" "Yes, she said a good deal yesterday, and today the men would not have struck if it had not been for her. It only needs a spark to set them off sometimes." Robert was very pale. "Well," he said, coolly, "there is no need for you to remain longer, since the factory is shut down. You may as well go." "The engineer is seeing to the fires, Mr. Lloyd," said Dennison. "Very well." Robert turned to the girl at the desk. "The factory is closed, Miss Stone," he said. "There is no need for you to remain longer to day. Come to morrow at 10 o'clock, and I will have something for you to do with regard to setting up accounts. There is nothing in shape now." That afternoon Robert went to see Ellen. He could not wait until evening. Fanny greeted him at the door, and there was the inevitable flurry about lighting the parlor stove, and presently Ellen entered. She had changed the gown which she had worn at her factory work for her last winter's best one. Her young face was pale, almost severe, and she met him in a way which made her seem a stranger. Robert realized suddenly that she had, as it were, closed the door upon all their old relations. She seemed years older, and at the same time indefinably younger, since she was letting the childish impulses, which are at the heart of all of us untouched by time and experience, rise rampant and unchecked. She was following the lead of her own convictions with the terrible unswerving of a child, even in the face of her own hurt. She was, metaphorically, bumping her own head against the floor in her vain struggles for mastery over the mighty conditions of her life. She bowed to Robert, and did not seem to see his proffered hand. "Won't you shake hands with me?" he asked, almost humbly, although his own wrath was beginning to rise. "No, I would rather not," she replied, with a straight look at him. Her blue eyes did not falter in the least. "May I sit down?" he said. "I have something I would like to say to you." "Certainly, if you wish," she replied. Then she seated herself on the sofa, with Robert opposite in the crushed plush easy chair. The room was still very cold, and the breath could be seen at the lips of each in white clouds. Robert had on his coat, but Ellen had nothing over her blue gown. It was on Robert's tongue to ask if she were not cold, then he refrained. The issues at stake seemed to make the question frivolous to offensiveness. He felt that any approach to tenderness when Ellen was in her present mood would invoke an indignation for which he could scarcely blame her, that he must try to meet her on equal fighting ground. Ellen sat before him, her little cold hands tightly folded in her lap, her mouth set hard, her steady fire of blue eyes on his face, waiting for him to speak. Robert felt a decided awkwardness about beginning to talk. Suddenly it occurred to him to wonder what there was to say. It amounted to this: they were in their two different positions, their two points of view. Would either leave for any argument of the other? Then he wondered if he could, in the face of a girl who wore an expression like that, stoop to make an argument, for the utter blindness and deafness of her very soul to any explanation of his position was too evident in her face. "I called to tell you, if you will permit me, how much I regret the unfortunate state of affairs at the factory," Robert said, and the girl's eyes met his as with a flash of flame. "Why did you not prevent it, then?" asked she. Ellen had all the fire of her family, but a steadiness of manner which never deserted her. She was never violent. "I could not prevent it," replied Robert, in a low voice. Ellen said nothing. "You mistake my position," said Robert. It was in his mind then to lay the matter fully before her, as he had disdained to do before the committee, but her next words deterred him. "I understand your position very fully," said she. Robert bowed. "There is only one way of looking at it," said Ellen, in her inexpressibly sweet, almost fanatical voice. She tossed her head, and the fluff of fair hair over her temples caught a beam of afternoon sunlight. "She is only a child," thought Robert, looking at her. He rose and crossed over to the sofa, and sat down beside her with a masterful impatience. "Look here, Ellen," he said, leaving all general issues for their own personal ones. "You are not going to let this come between us?" Ellen sat stiff and straight, and made no reply. "All this can make very little difference to you," Robert urged. "You know how I feel. That is, it can make very little difference to you if you still feel as you did. You must know that I have only been waiting, that I am eager and impatient to lift you out of it all." Ellen faced him. "Do you think I would be lifted out of it now?" she said. "Why, but, Ellen, you cannot." "Yes, I can. You do not know me." "Ellen, you are under a total misapprehension of my position." "No, I am not. I apprehend it perfectly." "Ellen, you cannot let this separate us." Ellen looked straight ahead in silence. "You at least owe it to me to tell me if, irrespective of this, your feelings have changed," Robert said, in a low voice. Ellen said nothing. "You may have come to prefer some one else," said Robert. "I prefer no one before my own, before all these poor people who are a part of my life," Ellen cried out, suddenly, her face flaming. Then why do you refuse to let me act for their final good? You must know what it means to have them thrown out of work in midwinter. You know the factory will remain closed for the present on account of a strike." "I did not doubt it," said Ellen in a hard voice. All the bitter thoughts to which she would not give utterance were in her voice. "I cannot continue to run the factory at the present rate and meet expenses," said Robert. "In fact, I have been steadily losing for the last month." He had, after all, descended to explanation. "It amounts to my either reducing the wage list or closing the factory altogether," he continued. "For my own good I ought to close the factory altogether, but I thought I would give the men a chance." Robert thought by saying that he must have finally settled matters. It did not enter his head that she would really think it advisable for him to continue losing money. The pure childishness of her attitude was something really beyond the comprehension of a man of business who had come into hard business theories along with his uncle's dollars. "What if you do lose money?" said Ellen. Robert stared at her. "I beg your pardon," said he. "What if you do lose money?" "A man cannot conduct business on such principles," replied Robert. "There would soon be no business to conduct. You don't understand." "Yes, I do understand fully," replied Ellen. Robert looked at her, at the clear, rosy curve of her young cheek, the toss of yellow hair above a forehead as candid as a baby's, at her little, delicate figure, and all at once such a rage of masculine insistence over all this obstinacy of reasoning was upon him that it was all he could do to keep himself from seizing her in his arms and forcing her to a view of his own horizon. He felt himself drawn up in opposition to an opponent, at once too delicate, too unreasoning, and too beloved to encounter. It seemed as if the absurdity of it would drive him mad, and yet he was held to it. He tried to give a desperate wrench aside from the main point of the situation. He leaned over Ellen so closely that his lips touched her hair. "Ellen, let us leave all this," he pleaded. "Let me talk to you. I had to wait a little while. I knew you would understand that, but let me talk to you now." Ellen sat as rigid as marble. "I wish to talk of nothing besides the matter at hand, Mr. Lloyd," said she. "That is too close to my heart for any personal consideration to come between." End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 54. When Robert went home in the winter twilight, he was more miserable than he had ever been in his life. He felt as if he had been assaulting a beautiful alabaster wall of unreason. He felt as if that which he could shatter at a blow had yet held him in defiance. The idea of this girl, of whom he had thought as his future wife, deliberately setting herself against him, galled him inexpressibly, and in spite of himself he could not quite free his mind of jealousy. On his way home he stopped at Lyman Risley's office, and found, to his great satisfaction, that he was alone, writing at his desk. Even his stenographer had gone home. He turned around when Robert entered, and looked at him with his quizzical yet kindly smile. "Well, how are you, boy?" he said. Robert dropped into the first chair, and sat therein, hunched up as in a lapse of despair and weariness. "What is the matter?" asked Risley. "You have heard about the trouble in the factory?" For answer Risley held up a night's paper with glaring headlines. "Yes, of course it is in the papers," assented Robert, wearily. Risley stared at him in a lazily puzzled fashion. "Well," he said, "what is it all about? Why are you so broken up about it?" Risley laid considerable emphasis on the "you." "Yes," cried Robert, in a sudden stress of indignation. "You look at it like all the rest. Why are all the laborers to be petted and coddled and the capitalists held up to execration? Good Lord, isn't there any pity for the rich man without his drop of water, in the Bible or out? Are all creation born with blinders on, and can they see only before their noses?" "What are you talking about, Robert?" said Risley, laughing a little. "I say, why should all the sympathy go to the workmen, who are acting like the pig-headed idiots they are, and none for the head of the factory, who has the sharp-edged, red-hot brunt of it all to bear?" "You wouldn't look at it that way if you were one of the poor men just out on strike such weather as this," said Risley, dryly. He glanced as he spoke at the window, which was beginning to be thickly furred with frost in spite of the heat of the office. Robert followed his gaze, and noted the spreading fairy jungle of crystalline trees and flowers on the broad field of glass. "Do you think that is the worst thing in the world to bear?" he demanded angrily. "What? Cold and hunger not only for yourself, but for those you love?" "Yes." "Well, I think it is pretty bad," replied Risley. "Well, suppose you had to bear that, at least, for those you loved, and," said the young man, lamely. Risley remained silent, waiting. "If I had been my uncle instead of myself, I should simply have shut down with no ado," said Robert presently, in an angry, argumentative voice. "I suppose you would. And, as it was, I thought I would give them a chance. Good God, Risley, I have been running the factory at a loss for a month as it is. With this new wage list I should no more than make expenses, if I did that. What was it to me? I did it to keep them in some sort of work. As for myself, I would much rather have shut down and done with it, but I tried to keep it running on their account, poor devils, and now I am execrated for it, and they have deliberately refused what little I could offer." "Did you explain all this to the committee?" asked Risley. "Explain? No, I told them my course was founded upon strict business principles, and was as much for their good as for mine. They understood. They know how hard the times are. Why, it was only last week that Weeks and McLaughlin failed, and that meant a heavy loss. I didn't explain." Then Robert hesitated and colored. "I have just explained to her," he said, with a curious hang of his head, like a boy. "And if my explanation was met in the same fashion by the others in the factory, I might as well have addressed the North Wind. They are all alike. They are a different race. We cannot help them, and they cannot help themselves, because they are themselves." "You mean by her, Ellen Brewster?" Risley said. Robert nodded gloomily. "That is all in the paper," said Risley, "what she said to the men." Robert made an impatient move. "If ever there was a purely normal outgrowth, a perfect flower of her birth and environments and training, that girl is one," said Risley, with an accent of admiration. "She is infected with the ranting idiocy of those with whom she has been brought in daily contact," said Robert, but even as he spoke he seemed to see the girl's dear young face, and his voice faltered. "Even as you may be infected with the conservatism of those with whom you are brought in contact?" said Risley, dryly. "What a democrat you are, Risley!" said Robert impatiently. "I believe you would make a good walking delegate." Risley laughed. "I think I would myself," he said. "Wouldn't she listen to you, Robert?" "She listened with such utter dissent that she might as well have been dumb. It is all over between us, Risley." "How precipitate you are, you young folks," said the other good humouredly. "How precipitate? Do you mean to say?" "I mean that you are forever thinking you are on the brink of nothingness, when the true horizon line is too far for you ever to reach in your mortal life." "Not in this case," said Robert. "You know nothing about it. But if you will excuse me, it seems to me that the matter of all these people being reduced to starvation in a howling winter is of more importance than the coming together of two people in the bonds of wedlock. It is the aggregate against the individual." "I don't deny that," said Robert, doggedly, "but I am not responsible for the starvation, and the aggregate have brought it on themselves." "You have shut down, finally?" "Yes, I have. I would rather shut down than not, as far as I am concerned. It is distinctly for my interest. The only one objection is losing experienced workmen, but in a community like this, and in times like this, that objection is reduced to a minimum. I can hire all I want in the spring, if I wish to open again. I should run a risk of losing on every order I should have to fill in the next 3 months, even with reduced list. I would rather shut down than not. I only reduce the wages for them." Robert rose as he spoke. He felt in his heart that he had gotten scant sympathy and comfort. The older man looked with pity at the young fellow's handsome, gloomy face. "There's one thing to remember," he said. "What?" "All the troubles of this world are born with wings." Risley laughed as he spoke, in his half cynical fashion. As Robert walked home, for there was no car due, he felt completely desolate. It seemed to him that everybody was in league against him. When he reached his uncle's splendid house and entered, he felt such an isolation from his kind in the midst of his wealth that something like an actual terror of solitude came over him. The impecunious cousin of his aunt's, who had come to her during her last illness, acted as his housekeeper. There was something inexpressibly irritating about this woman, who had suffered so much, and was now nestling, with a sense of triumph over the passing of her griefs, in a luxurious home. She asked Robert if it were true that the factory was closed, and he felt that she noted his gloomy face, and realized a greater extent of comfort from her own exemption from such questions. "Business must be a great care," said she, and a look of utter peaceful reflection upon her own lot overspread her face. After supper, Robert went down to his Aunt Cynthia's. He had not been there for a long time. The minute he entered, she started up with an eagerness which had been completely foreign to her of late years. "What is the matter, Robert?" she asked, softly. She took both his hands as she spoke, and her look in his face was full of delicate caressing. Robert succumbed at once to this feminine solicitude, of which he had had lately so little. He felt as if he had relapsed into childhood. A sense of injury which was exquisite, as it brought along with it a sense of his demand upon love and sympathy, seized him. "I am worried beyond endurance, Aunt Cynthia," said he. "About the strike? I have read the night papers." "Yes, I tried to do what was right, even at a sacrifice to myself and—" Cynthia had read about Ellen, but she was a woman, and she said nothing as to that. "I tried to do what was right," Robert said, fairly broken down again. Cynthia had seated herself, and Robert had taken a low footstool at her side. It came over him as he did so that it had been a favorite seat of his when a child. As for Cynthia, influenced by the appealing to the vulnerable place of her nature, she put her slim hands on her nephew's head, and actually seemed to feel his baby curls. "Poor boy," she whispered. Robert put both his arms around her and hid his face on her shoulder, for love is a comforter, in whatever guise. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Ferrari. Chapter 55. On the day after the strike, Ellen went to McGuire's and to Briggs, the two other factories in Rowe, to see if she could obtain a position, but she was not successful. McGuire had discharged some of his employees, reducing his force to its smallest possible limits, since he had fewer orders, and was trying in that way to avert the necessity of a cut in wages and a strike or shutdown. McGuire's was essentially a union factory, as was Briggs's. Ellen would have found in either case difficulty about obtaining employment, because she did not belong to the union, if for no other reason. At Briggs's she encountered the proprietor himself in the office, and he dismissed her with a bluff, almost brutal peremptoriness which hurt her cruelly, although she held up her head high as she left. Briggs turned to a foreman who was standing by before she was well out of hearing. "I like that," he said. "Mrs. Briggs read about that girl in the paper last night, and the strike wouldn't have been on at Lloyd's if it hadn't been for her. I would as soon take a lighted match into a powder magazine." The foreman grinned. "She's a pretty mild looking thing," he said. "Doesn't look as if she could say boo to a goose." "That's all you can tell," returned Briggs. "Deliver me from a light complexioned woman. They're all the very devil. Mrs. Briggs says it's the same girl that read that composition that made such a stir at the high school exhibition. She'd make more trouble in a factory than a dozen ordinary girls, and just now, when everything is darned ticklish looking." "That's so," assented the foreman, "and all the more because she's good looking." "I don't know what you call good looking," returned Briggs. He had two daughters, built upon the same heavy lines as himself and wife, and he adored them. Insensibly he regarded all more delicate feminine beauty as a disparagement of theirs. As Briggs spoke, the foreman seemed to see in the air before his eyes the faces of the two Briggs girls, large and massive and dull of hue, the feminine counterpart of their fathers. "Well, maybe you're right," said he, evasively. "I suppose some might call her good looking." As he spoke he glanced out of the window at Ellen's retreating figure, moving away over the snow path with an almost dancing motion of youth and courage, though she was sorely hurt. The girl had scarcely ever had a hard word said to her in her whole life, for she had been, in her humble place, a petted darling. She had plenty of courage to bear the hard words now, but they cut deeply into her unseasoned heart. Ellen went on past the factories to the main street of Rowe. She had no idea of giving up her efforts to obtain employment. She said to herself that she must have work. She thought of the stores, that possibly she might obtain a chance to serve as a salesgirl in one of them. She actually began at the end of the long street, and worked her way through it, with her useless inquiries, facing proprietors and superintendents, but with no success. There was not a vacancy in more than one or two, and there they wished only experienced hands. She found out that her factory record told against her. The moment she admitted that she had worked in a factory, the cold shoulder was turned. The position of a shop girl was so far below that of a saleslady that the effect upon the superintendent was almost as if he had met an unworthy aspirant to a throne. He would smile insultingly and incredulously, even as he regarded her. "You would find that our goods are too fine to handle after leather. Have you tried all the shops?" At last Ellen gave that up, and started homeward. She paused once as she came opposite an intelligence office. There was one course yet open to her, but from that she shrank, not on her own account, but she dared not, knowing what would be the sufferings of her relatives should she do so, apply for a position as a servant. As for herself, strained as she was to her height of youthful enthusiasm for a great cause, as she judged it to be, clamping her feet to the topmost round of her ladder of difficulty, she would have essayed any honest labor with no hesitation whatever. But she thought of her father and mother and grandmother, and went on past the intelligence office. When she came to her old school teacher's, Miss Mitchell's, house, she paused and hesitated a moment. Then she went up the little path between the snowbanks to the front door, and rang the bell. The door was opened before the echoes had died away. Miss Mitchell had seen her coming, and hastened to open it. Miss Mitchell had not been teaching school for many years, having retired on a small competency of her savings. Her mortgage was paid, and there was enough for herself and her mother to live upon, with infinite care as to details of expenditure. Every postage stamp and car fare had its important part in the school teacher's system of economy, but she was quite happy, and her large face wore an expression of perfect peace and placidity. She was a woman who was not tortured by any strong, ungratified desires. Her allotment of the gifts of the gods quite satisfied her. When Ellen entered the rather stuffy sitting room, for Miss Mitchell and her mother were jealous of any breath of cold air after the scanty fire was kindled, it was like entering into a stratum of peace. It seemed quite removed from the turmoil of her own life. The school teacher's old mother sat in her rocker close to the stove, stouter than ever, filling up her chair with those wandering curves and vague outlines which only the over fleshy human form can assume. She looked as indefinite as a quivering jelly until one reached her face. That wore a fixedness of amiability which accentuated the whole like a high light. She had not seen Ellen for a long time, and she greeted her with delight. "Bless your heart," said she, in her sweet, throaty, husky voice. "Go and get her some of them cookies, Fanny, do." The old woman's faculties were not in the least impaired, although she was very old. Neither had her hands lost their cunning, for she still retained her skill in cookery, and prepared the simple meals for herself and daughter, seated in a high chair at the kitchen table to roll out pastry, or the famous little cookies which Ellen remembered along with her childhood. There was something about these cookies which Miss Mitchell presently brought to her in a pretty china plate, with a little fine fringed napkin, which was like a morsel of solace to the girl. With the first sweet crumble of the cake on her plate she wished to cry. Sometimes the rush of old, kindly, tender associations will overcome one who is quite equal to the strain of present emergency. But she did not cry. She ate her cookies, and confided to Miss Mitchell and her mother her desire to obtain a position elsewhere, since her factory work had failed her. It had occurred to her that possibly Miss Mitchell, who was on the school board, might know of a vacancy in a primary school for the coming spring term, and that she might obtain it. "I think I know enough to teach a primary school," Ellen said. "Of course you do, bless your heart," said old Mrs. Mitchell. "She knows enough to teach any kind of a school, don't she, Fanny? You get her a school, dear, right away." But Miss Mitchell knew of no probable vacancy, since one young woman who had expected to be married had postponed her marriage on account of the strike in Lloyd's, and the consequent throwing out of employment of her sweetheart. Then, also, Miss Mitchell owned with hesitation, in response to Ellen's insistent question, that she supposed that the fact that she had worked in a shop might in any case interfere with her obtaining a position in a school. "There is no sense in it, dear child, I know," she said, "but it might be so." "Yes, I suppose so," replied Ellen bitterly. "They would all say that a shop girl had no right to try to teach school. Well, I'm much obliged to you, Miss Mitchell." "What are you going to do?" Miss Mitchell asked anxiously, following her to the door. "I'm going to Mrs. Doty to get some of the wrappers that mother works on, until something else turns up," replied Ellen. "It seems a pity." Ellen smiled bravely. "Beggars mustn't be choosers," she said. "If we can only keep along somehow, I don't care." There came a vehement pound of a stick on the door, for that was the way the old woman in the sitting room commanded attention. Miss Mitchell opened the door on a crack, that she might not let in the cold air. "What is it, mother?" she said. "You get Ellen a school right away, Fanny." "All right, mother, I'll do my best." Get her the grammar school you used to have." "All right, mother." There was something about the imperative solicitude of the old woman which comforted Ellen in spite of its futility as she went on her way. The good will of another human soul, even when it cannot be resolved into active benefits, has undoubtedly a mighty force of its own. Ellen, with the sweet of the cookies still lingering on her tongue, and the sweet of the old woman's kindness in her soul, felt refreshed as if by some subtle spiritual cake and wine. She even went to the door of Mrs. Doty's house. Mrs. Doty was the woman who let out wrappers to her impecunious neighbors with an undaunted heart. She had no difficulty there. The demand for cheap wrappers was not on the wane, even in the hard times. When Ellen reached her grandmother's house with a great parcel under her arm, Mrs. Zelotes opened her side door. "What have you got there, Ellen Brewster?" she called out sharply. "Some wrappers," replied Ellen, cheerfully. "Are you going to work on wrappers?" "Yes, grandma." The door was shut with a loud report. When Ellen entered the house and the sitting room, her mother looked up from a pink wrapper which she was finishing. "What have you got there?" she demanded. "Some wrappers." "Why, I haven't finished the last lot." "These are for me to make, mother." Andrew got up and went out of the room. Fanny shut her mouth hard and drew her thread through with a jerk. "Well," she said in a second, "take off your things and let me show you how to start on them. There's a little knack about it." End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Chapter 56. That was a hard winter for Rowe. Aside from the financial stress, the elements seemed to conspire against the people who were so ill prepared to meet their fury. It was the coldest winter which had been known for years. Coal was higher, and the poor people had less coal to burn. Storm succeeded storm. Then, when there came a warm spell, there was an epidemic of the grippe, and doctors' bills to pay, and quinine to buy, and quinine was very dear. The Brewsters managed to keep up the interest on the house mortgage, but their living expenses were reduced to the smallest possible amount. In those days there was no wood laid ready for kindling in the parlor stove, since there was neither any wood to spare nor expectation of Robert's calling. Ellen and her mother sat in the dining room, for even the sitting room fire had been abolished, and they heated the dining room whenever the weather admitted it from the kitchen stove, and worked on the wrappers for their miserable pittance. The repeated storms were in a way a boon to Andrew, since he got many jobs clearing paths, and thus secured a trifle towards the daily expenses. In those days Mrs. Zelotes watched the butcher cart anxiously when it stopped before her son's house, and she knew just what a tiny bit of meat was purchased, and how seldom. On the days when the cart moved on without any consultation at the tail thereof, the old woman would buy an extra portion, cook it, and carry some over to her sons. Times grew harder and harder. Few of the operatives who had struck in Lloyd's succeeded in obtaining employment elsewhere, and most of them joined the union to enable them to do so. There was actual privation. One evening, when the strike was some 6 weeks old, Abby Atkins came over in a pouring rain to see Ellen. There were a number of men in the dining room that night. Amos Lee and Frank Dixon were among them. It was a singular thing that Andrew, taking, as he had done, no active part in any rebellion against authority, should have come to see his house the headquarters for the rallies of dissension. Men seemed to come to Andrew Brewster's for the sake of bolstering themselves up in their hard position of defiance against tremendous odds, though he sat by and seldom said a word. As for Ellen, she and her mother on these occasions sat out in the kitchen, sewing on the endless seams of the endless wrappers. Sometimes it seemed to the girl as if wrappers enough were being made to clothe not only the present but future generations of poor women. She seemed to see whole armies of hopeless, overburdened women, all arrayed in these slouching garments, crowding the foreground of the world. That evening little Amabel, who had developed a painful desire to make herself useful, having divined the altered state of the family finances, was pulling out basting threads with a puckered little face bent over her work. She was a very thin child, but there was an incisive vitality in her, and somehow Fanny and Ellen contrived to keep her prettily and comfortably clothed. "I've got to do my duty by poor Eva's child if I starve," Fanny often said. When the side door opened, Ellen and her mother thought it was another man come to swell the company in the dining room. "It beats all how men like to come and sit round and talk over matters. For my part, I 'ain't got any time to talk. I've got to work," remarked Fanny. "That's so," rejoined Ellen. She looked curiously like her mother that night, and spoke like her. In her heart she echoed the sarcasm to the full. She despised those men for sitting hour after hour in a store or in the house of some congenial spirit, or standing on a street corner and talking, she was sure, to no purpose. As for herself, she had done what she thought right. She had, as it were, cut short the thread of her happiness of life for the sake of something undefined and rather vague, and yet as mighty in its demands for her allegiance as God. And it was done, and there was no use in talking about it. She had her wrappers to make. However, she told herself extenuatingly, men can't sew, so they can't work evenings. They are better off talking here than they would be in the billiard saloon. Ellen, at that time of her life, had a slight, unacknowledged feeling of superiority over men of her own class. She regarded them very much as she regarded children, with a sort of tolerant good will and contempt. Now, suddenly, she raised her head and listened. "That isn't another man. It's a woman. It's Abby," she said to her mother. "She wouldn't come out in all this rain," replied Fanny. As she spoke, a great wind driven wash of it came over the windows. "Yes, it is," said Ellen, and she jumped up and opened the dining room door. Abby had entered, as was her custom, without knocking. She had left her dripping umbrella in the entry, and her old hat was flattened on to her head with wet, and several damp locks of her hair straggled from under it and clung to her thin cheeks. She still held up her wet skirts around her, as she had held them out of doors, but she was gesticulating violently with her other hand. She was repeating what she had said before. Ellen had heard her indistinctly through the door. "Yes, I mean just what I say," she cried. "Get up and go to work, if you are men. Stop hanging around stores and corners and talking about the tyranny of the rich, and go to work, and make them pay you something for it. Anyhow, this has been kept up long enough. Get up and go to work, if you don't want those belonging to you to starve." Abby caught sight of Ellen, pale and breathless, in the door, with her mother looking over her shoulder, and she addressed her with renewed violence. "Come here, Ellen," she said, "and put yourself on my side. We've got to give in." "You go away," cried little Amabel, in a shrill voice, looking around Ellen's arm, but nobody paid any attention to her. "I never will," returned Ellen with a great flash, but her voice trembled. "You've got to," said Abby. "I tell you there's no other way." "I'll die before I give up," cried Lee, in a loud, threatening voice. "I'm with ye," said Tom Peel. Dixon and the young laster who sat beside him looked at each other, but said nothing. Dixon wrinkled his forehead over his pipe. "Then you'd better go to work quick, before some that I know of, who are enough sight better worth saving than you are, starve," replied Abby, unshrinkingly. "If I could, I would go to Lloyd's and open it on my own account to morrow. I believe in bravery, but nothing except fools and swine jump over precipices." Abby passed through the room. sprinkling raindrops from her drenched skirts, and went into the kitchen with Ellen. Fanny cast an angry glance at her, then a solicitous one at her dripping garments. "Abby Atkins, you haven't got any rubbers on," said she. "Rubbers?" repeated Abby. "You just slip off those wet skirts, and Amabel will fetch you down Ellen's old black petticoat and brown dress. Amabel?" But Abby seated herself peremptorily before the kitchen stove and extended one soaked little foot in its shabby boot. "I'm past thinking or caring about wet skirts," said she. "Good Lord, what do wet skirts matter? We can't make wrappers any longer. We had to sell the sewing machine yesterday to pay the rent or be turned out, and we haven't got a thing to eat in the house except potatoes and a little flour. We haven't had any meat for a week. Nice fare for a man like poor father and a girl like Maria. We have come down to the kitchen fire like you, but we can't keep it burning as late as this. The rest went to bed an hour ago to keep warm. Maria has got more cold. She did seem better one spell, but now she's worse again. Our chamber is freezing cold, and we haven't had a fire in it since the strike. John Sargent has ransacked every town within 20 miles for work, but he can't get any, and his sick sister keeps sending to him for money. He looks as if he was just about done, too. He went off somewhere after supper. A great supper. He don't smoke a pipe nowadays. Father don't get the medicine he ought to have, and that cold spell he just about perished for a little whiskey. The bedroom was like ice with no fire in the sitting room, and he didn't sleep warm. It's one awful thing after another happening. Did you know Mamie Brady took laudanum last night?" "Good land!" said Fanny. "Yes, she did. Ed Flynn has been playing fast and loose with her for a long time, and she's none too well balanced, and when it came to her not having enough to eat and to keep her warm, and her mother nagging at her all the time, you know what an awful hard woman her mother is, she got desperate. She gulped it down when the last car went past and Ed Flynn hadn't come. She had been watching out for him. Then she told her mother, and her mother shook her. Then run for Dr. Fox, and he called in Dr. Lord, and they worked with the stomach pump till morning, and she isn't out of danger yet. Then that isn't all. Willie Jones' mother is failing. He was over to our house last evening telling us about it, and he fairly cried, poor boy. He said he actually could not get her what she needed to make her comfortable this awful winter. It was all he could do with odd jobs to keep the roof over their heads, that she hadn't actually enough to eat and keep her warm. It seemed as if he would die when he told about it. And that isn't all. Those little Blake children next door are fairly starving. They are going around to the neighbors' swill buckets. It's a fact, just like little hungry dogs, and it's precious little they find in them. Mrs. Weatherhead has let her sewing machine go, and Edward Morse is going to be sold out for taxes. And that isn't all." Abby lowered her voice a little. She cast an apprehensive glance at the door of the other room and at Amabel. "Mamie Bemis has gone to the bad. I had it straight. She's in Boston. She didn't have enough to pay for her board, and got desperate. I know her sister did wrong, but that was no reason why she should have, and I don't believe she would if it hadn't been for the strike. It's all on account of the strike. There's no use talking. Before the sparrow flies in the eyes of the tiger, he'd better count the cost." Fanny, quite white, stood staring from Abby to Ellen and back again. Amabel was holding fast to a fold of Ellen's skirt. Ellen looked rigid. "I knew it all before," she said in a low voice. Suddenly Abby jumped up and caught the other girl in a fierce embrace. "Ellen," she sobbed, "Ellen, isn't there any way out of it? I can't see." Ellen freed herself from Abby with a curious imperative yet gentle motion. Then she opened the door into the other room again. The loud clash of voices hushed, and every man faced towards her standing on the threshold. with her mother and Abby and little Amabel in the background. "I want to say to you all," said Ellen in a clear voice, "that I think I did wrong. I have been wondering if I had not for some time, and growing more and more certain. I did not count the cost. All I thought of was the principle, but the cost is a part of the principle in this world, and it has to be counted in with it. I see now. I don't think the strike ought ever to have been. It has brought about too much suffering upon those who were not responsible for it, who did not choose it of their own free will. There are children starving, and people dying and breaking their hearts. We have brought too much upon ourselves and others. I am sorry I said what I did in the shop that day, if I influenced anyone. Now I am not going to strike any longer. Let us all accept Mr. Lloyd's terms, and go back to work." But Ellen's voice was drowned out in a great shout of wrath and dissent from Lee. He directly leapt to the conclusion that the girl took this attitude on account of Lloyd, and his jealousy, which was always smoldering, flamed. "Well, I guess not," he shouted. "I rather guess not. I've struck, and I'm going to stay struck. I ain't going to back out because a girl likes the boss. Damn him!" Andrew and the young laster rose and moved quietly before Ellen. Tom Peel said nothing, but he grinned imperturbably. "I ain't had a bit of tobacco, and the less said about what I've had to eat, the better," Lee went on, in a loud, threatening voice, "but I ain't going to give up. No, miss, you've het up the fighting blood in me, and it ain't so easy coolin' of it down." The door opened, and Granville Joy entered. He had knocked several times, but nobody had heard him. He looked inquiringly from one to another, then moved beside Andrew and the laster. Dixon got up. "It looks to me as if it was too soon to be giving up now," he said. "It's easy for a man who's got nobody dependent upon him to talk," cried Abby. "I won't give up," cried Dixon, looking straight at Ellen, and ignoring Abby. "That's so," said Lee. "We don't give up our rights for bosses, or bosses' misses." As he said that, there was a concerted movement of Andrew, the laster, and Granville. Granville was much slighter than Lee, but suddenly his right arm shot out and the other man went down like a log. Andrew followed him up with a kick. "Get out of my house," he shouted, "and never set foot in it again. Out with you!" Lee was easily cowed. He did not attempt to make any resistance, but gathered himself up, muttering, and moved before the three into the entry, where he had left his coat and hat. Dixon and Peel followed him. When the door was shut, Ellen turned to the others with a quieting hand on Amabel's head, who was clinging to her trembling. "I think it will be best to talk to John Sargent," said she. "I think a committee had better be appointed to wait upon Mr. Lloyd again and ask him to open the factory. I'm not going to strike any longer." "I'm sure I'm not," said Abby. "Abby and I are not going to strike any longer," said Ellen, in an indescribably childlike way, which yet carried enormous weight with it. End of chapter 56.
Chapter 57 of The Portion of Labor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chamlis. The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins FREEMAN. Chapter 57. Ellen had not arrived at her decision with regard to the strike as suddenly as it might have seemed. All winter, ever since the strike, Ellen had been wondering, not whether the principle of the matter was correct or not. That she never doubted. She never swerved in her belief concerning the cruel tyranny of the rich and the helpless suffering of the poor, and their good reason for making a stand, but she doubted more and more the wisdom of it. She used to sit for hours up in her chamber after the father and mother had gone to bed, wrapped up in old shawl against the cold, resting her elbows on the window-sill, and her chin on her two hands, staring out into the night and reflecting. Her youthful enthusiasm carried her like a leaping pole to conclusions beyond her years. "I wonder," she said to herself, "if, after all, this inequality of possessions is not a part of the system of creation, if the righting of them is not beyond the flaming sword of the Garden of Eden. I wonder if the one who tries to right them forcibly is not meddling and usurping the part of the Creator, and bringing down wrath and confusion not only upon his own head, but upon the heads of others. I wonder if it is wise, in order to establish a principle, to make those who have no voice in the matter suffer for it, the helpless women and children." She even thought with a sort of scornful sympathy of Sadie Peel, who could not have her near Seal Cape, and had not wished to strike. She reflected, as she had done so many times before, that the world was very old, thousands of years old, and inequality was as old as the world. Might it not even be a condition of its existence, the shifting of weights which kept it to its path in the scheme of the universe? And yet she always went back to her firm belief that the strikers were right, and always, although she loved Robert Lloyd, she denounced him. Even when it came to her abandoning her position with regard to the strike, she had not the slightest thought of effecting thereby a reconciliation with Robert. For the first time, that night when she had gone to bed after announcing her determination to go back to work, she questioned her affection for Robert. Before she had always admitted to herself, with a sort of shamed and angry dignity, "Other women feel so about men, and why should I not?" She had said, "And I shall never fail to keep the feeling behind more important things." She had accepted the fact of it with childlike straightforwardness, as she accepted all other facts of life, and now she wondered if she really did care for him so much. She thought over and over everything Abby had said, and saw plainly before her mental vision those poor women parting with their cherished possessions, the little starving children snatching at the refuse buckets at the neighbors' back doors. She saw with incredulous shame, and something between pity and scorn, Mamie Bemis, who had gone wrong, and Mamie Brady, who had taken her foolish, ill-balanced life in her own hands. She remembered every word which she had said to the men on the morning of the strike, and how they had started up and left their machines. "I did it all," she told herself. "I am responsible for it all this suffering, for those hungry little children, for those possible death, for the ruin of another girl." Then she told herself with a stern sense of justice that back of her responsibility came Robert Lloyd's. If he had not cut the wages, it would never have been. It seemed to her that she almost hated him, and that she could not wait to strive to undo the harm which she had done. She could not wait for morning to come. She lay awake all night in fever of impatience. When she went downstairs her eyes were brilliant, there were red spots on her cheeks, her lips were tense, her whole face looked as if she were strained for some leap of action. She took hold of everything she touched with a hard grip. Her father and mother kept watching her anxiously. Directly after breakfast, Ellen put up her hat and coat. "What are you going to do?" asked Fanny. "I am going over to see John Sargent and ask him to get some other men and go to see Mr. Lloyd, and tell him that we are willing to go to work again," replied Ellen. Ellen discovered, when she reached the Atkins house, that John Sargent had already resolved upon his course of action. The first thing he said when he came in last night was that he couldn't stand it any longer, and that he was going to see the others and go to Lloyd and ask him to open the shop on his own terms, said Abby. "I told him how we felt about it." "Yes, I am ready to go back whenever the factory is opened," said Ellen. "I am glad he has gone." Ellen did not remain long. She was anxious to return and finish some wrappers she had on hand. Abby promised to go over and let her know the result of the interview with Lloyd. It was not until evening that Abby came over, and John Sargent with her. Lloyd had not been at home in the morning, and they had been forced to wait until late afternoon. The two entered the dining room, where Ellen and her mother sat at work. Abby spoke at once, and to the point. "Well," said she, "the shop's going to be open tomorrow." "On what terms?" asked Ellen. "On the boss's, of course," replied Abby in a hard voice. "It's the only thing to do," said Sargent, with a sort of stolid assertion. "If we are willing to be crushed under the juggernaut of principle, we haven't any right to force others under, and that's what we are doing." "Bread without butter is better than no bread at all," said Abby. "We've got to live in the sphere in which Providence has placed us." The girl said Providence with a sarcastic emphasis. Andrew was looking at Sargent. "Do you think there will be any trouble?" he asked. Sargent hesitated, with a glance at Fanny. "I don't know. I hope not," said he. "Lee and Dixon are opposed to giving in, and they are talking hard tonight in the store. Then some of the men have joined the union since the strike, and of course they swear by it because it had been helping them, and they won't approve of giving up. But I doubt there will be much trouble. I guess the majority want to go to work, even the union men. The amount of it is, it has been such a tough winter it had taken the spirit out of the poor souls." Sargent, evidently in yielding, was resisting himself. "You don't think there will be any danger?" Fanny said, anxiously looking at Ellen. "Oh no, there's no danger for the girls anyhow. I guess there's enough men to look out for them. There's no need for you to worry, Mrs. Brewster." "Mr. Lloyd did not offer to do anything better about the wages?" asked Ellen. Sargent shook his head. "Catch him!" said Abby bitterly. Ellen had a feeling as if she were smiting in the face of that image of Robert which always dwelt in her heart. "Well," said Abby with a mirthless laugh, "there's one thing. According to the scriptures, it is as hard for the rich man to get into heaven as it is for the poor men to get into their factories." "You don't suppose there will be any danger?" Fanny said again, anxiously. "Danger? No. Who's afraid of Amos Lee and a few like him?" cried Abby contemptuously. "And Nahum Beals is safe. He's going to be tried next month, they say, but they'll make it imprisonment for life, because they think he wasn't in his right mind. If he was here, we might be afraid, but there's nobody now that will do anything but talk. I ain't afraid. I'm going to march up to the shop tomorrow morning and go to work, and I'd like to see anybody stop me." However, before they left, John Sargent spoke aside with Andrew and told him of a plan for the returning workmen to meet at the corner of a certain street and go in a body to the factory, and suggested that there might be pickets posted by the union men, and Andrew resolved to go with Ellen. The next morning the rain had quite ceased, and there was a faint something, rather a reminiscence than a suggestion, of early spring in the air. People had caught themselves looking hard at the elm branches to see if they were acquiring the virile fringe of spring, or if their eyes deceived them, and wondered, with respect to the tips of the maple and horse-chestnut branches, whether or not they were swollen, red, and glossy. Something they sniffed incredulously when a soft gust of south wind seemed laden with fresh blossom fragrance. "I declare, if I didn't know better, I should think I smelled apple blossoms," said Maria. "Stuff!" returned Abby. She was marching along with an alert, springy motion of her lean little body. She was keenly alive to the situation, and scented something besides apple blossom. She had tried to induce Maria to remain at home. "I don't know but there'll be trouble, and if there is, you'll be just in the way," she told her before they left the house, but not in their parents' hearing. "Oh, I don't believe there will be any. Folks will be too glad to get back to work," replied Maria. She had a vein of obstinacy, gentle as she was. Then, too, she had a reason which no one suspected for wishing to be present. She would not yield when John Sargent begged her privately not to go. It was just because she was afraid there might be trouble and he was going to be in it, that she could not bear to stay at home herself. Andrew had insisted upon accompanying Ellen in spite of her remonstrances. "I've got an errand down to the store," he said evasively, but Ellen understood. "I don't think there is any danger, and there wouldn't be any danger for me, nor for the girls, sure," she said, but he persisted. "Don't you say a word to your mother to scare her," he whispered. But they had not been gone long before Fanny followed them, Miss Zelotes watching her furtively from a window as she went by. All the returning employees met, as agreed upon, at the corner of a certain street, and marched in a solid body towards Lloyd's. The men insisted upon placing the girls in the center of this body, although some of them rebelled, notably Sadie Peel. She was on hand, laughing at defiant. "I guess I ain't afraid," she proclaimed. "Father's keeping on striking, but I guess he won't see his own daughter hurt. And now I'm going to have my nearseal cape, if it is late in the season. They're cheaper now, that's one good thing. On some accounts the strike had been a lucky thing for me." She marched along, swinging her arms jauntily. Ellen and Maria and Abby were close together. Andrew was on the right of Ellen, Granville Joy behind. The young laster, who had called so frequently evenings, was with him. John Sargent and Willie Jones were on the left. They all walked in the middle of the street like an army. It was covertly understood that there might be trouble. Some of the younger men from time to time put hands on their pockets, and a number carried stout sticks. The first intimation of disturbance came when they met an electric car, and all moved to one side to let it pass. The car was quite full of people going to another town, some 30 miles distant, to work in a large factory there. Nearly every man and woman on the car belonged to the union. As this car slid past, a great yell went up from the occupants. Men on the platform swung their arms in execration and derision. "Scab! Scab!" they called. A young fellow leaped from the real platform, caught up a stone, and flung it at the returning Lloyd men, but it went wide of its mark. Then he was back on the platform with a running jump, and one of the Lloyd men threw a stone, which missed him. The yell of "Scab! Scab!" went up with renewed vigor, until it died out of hearing along with the rumble of the car. "Sometimes I wish I had joined the union and stuck it out," said one of the Lloyd men gloomily. "For the Lord's sake, don't show white feather now," cried a young fellow beside him, who was striding on with an eager, even joyous outlook. He had fighting blood, and it was up, and he took a keen delight in the situation. "It's easy to talk," grumbled the other man. "I don't know, but all the help lies in the union, and we've been a pack of fools not to go in with them, because we hoped Lloyd would weaken and he would take us back. He hasn't weakened, we've had to. Good God, them that's rich have it their own way. I'd have joined the union in a minute, and got a job and got my nearseal cape, if it hadn't been for father," said Sadie Peel with a loud laugh. "But, my land, if father'd caught me joining the union, I dunno as there would have been anything left of me to wear the cape." They all marched along with no disturbance, until they reached the corner of the street into which they had to turn in order to approach Lloyd's. There they were confronted by a line of pickets stationed there by the union, and the real trouble began. Yells of "Scab! Scab!" filled the air. "Good land, I ain't no more of a scab than you be," shrieked Sadie Peel in a loud, angry voice. "Scab yourself! Touch me if you das!" Many young men among the returning force had stout sticks in their hands. Granville Joy was one of them. Andrews was quite unarmed, pressed in before Ellen. Granville caught him by the arm and tried to draw him back. "Look here, Mr. Brewster," he said, "you keep in the background a little. I am young and strong, and here are Sargent and Mendon. You'd better keep back." But Ellen, with a spring which was effectual because so utterly uncalculated, was before Granville and her father and them all. She reasoned it out in a second that she was responsible for the strike, and that she would be in front of whatever danger there was in consequence. Her slight little figure passed them all before they knew what she was doing. She was in the very front of the little returning army. She saw the threatening faces of the pickets. She half turned and waved arm of encouragement, like a general in a battle. "Strike if you want to," she cried out in her sweet young voice. "If you want to kill a girl for going back to work to save herself and her friends from starvation, do it. I am not afraid, but kill me if you must kill anybody, because I am the one that started the strike. Strike if you want to." The opposing force moved aside, with an almost imperceptible motion. Ellen looked like a beautiful child, her light hair tossed around her rosy face, her eyes full of the daring of perfect confidence. She in reality did not feel one throb of fear. She passed the picket line and turned instinctively and marched backwards with her blue eyes upon them all. Abby Atkins sprang forward to Ellen's side with Sargent and Joy and Willie Jones and Andrew. Andrew kept calling to Ellen to come back, but she did not heed him. The little army was several rods from the pickets before a shot rang out, but it was fired into the air. However, it was followed by a fierce clamour of scab and a shower of stones which did little harm. The Lloyds marched on without a word, except from Sadie Peel. She turned round with a derisive shout. "Scab yourselves!" she shrieked. "You dasn't fire at me! You're scabs yourselves, you be!" "Scabs, scabs!" shouted men, moving forward. "Scab yourself!" shouted Sadie Peel. Abby Atkins caught hold of her arm and shook her violently. "Shut up, can't you, Sadie Peel?" she said. "I'll shut up when I get ready, Abby Atkins. I ain't afraid of them, if you be. They dasn't hit me. Scab, scab!" the girl yelled back with a hysteric laugh. "Don't that girl know anything?" growled the man behind her. "Shut up, Sadie Peel," said Abby Atkins. "I ain't afraid if you be, and I won't shut up till I get ready, for you or anybody else. I'm going to have my nearseal cape. Hi!" "I ain't afraid," said Abby contemptuously, "but I've got sense." Maria pressed close to Sadie Peel. "Please, do keep still, Sadie," she pleaded. "Let us get into the factory as quietly as we can. Think if anybody was hurt." "I ain't afraid," shrieked the girl, with a toss of her red fringe, and she laughed like a parrot. Abby Atkins gripped her arm so fiercely that she made her cry out with pain. "If you don't keep still," she said threateningly. Willie Jones was walking as near as he could, and carried his right arm half extended as if to guard her. Now and then Abby turned and gave him a push backward. "They won't trouble us girls, and you might as well let us and the men that have sticks go first," she said in a whisper. "If you think—" began the young fellow, colouring. "Oh, I know you ain't afraid," said Abby, "but you've got your mother to think of, and there's no use in running into danger." The pickets were gradually left behind. They were, in truth, half-hearted. Many of them had worked in Lloyd's, and had small mind to injure their old comrades. They were not averse to a great show of indignation and bluster, but when it came to more, they hesitated. Presently, the company came into open space before Lloyd's. Robert and Lyman Risley and several foremen were standing at the foot of the stairs. The windows of the factory were filled with faces, and derisive cries came from them. Lloyd's tall shaft of chimney was plumed with smoke. The employees advanced towards the stairs, when suddenly Amos Lee, Dixon, and a dozen others appeared, coming with a rush from around the corner of the building, and again the air was filled with cry of "Scab!" Ellen and Abby linked arms and sprang forward before the men with an impetuous rush, with Joy and Willie Jones and Andrew following. Ellen, as she rushed on towards the factory stairs, was conscious of no fear at all, but rather of sort of exultation, of courage. It did not really occur to her that she could be hurt, that it could be in the heart of Lee or Dixon or any of them actually to harm her. She was throbbing and intense with indignation and resolution. Into that factory to her work she was bound to go. All that intimidated her in the least was the fear for her father. She rushed as fast as she could that her father might not get before her and be hurt in some way. "Scab! Scab!" shouted Lee and the others. "Scab yourself!" shrieked Sadie Peel. Her father was one of the opposing party, and that gave her perfect audacity. "Look out you don't hit me, Dad," she cried to him. "I'm going to get my near-seal cape. Don't you hit your daughter, Tom Peel." She raced with a sort of hoppity skip. She caught a young man near her by the arm and forced him into the same dancing motion. They were at the foot of the stairs when Robert, watching, saw Lee with a pistol in his hand aim straight at Ellen. He sprang before her, but Risley was nearer, and the shot struck him. When Risley fell, a great cry, it would have been difficult to tell whether of triumph or horror, went up from the open windows of the other factories, and men came swarming out. Lee and his companions vanished. A great crowd gathered round Risley until the doctors came and ordered them away, and carried him in the ambulance to the hospital. He was not dead, but evidently very seriously injured. When the ambulance had rolled out of sight, the Lloyd employees entered the factory, and the hum of machinery began. Fanny and Andrew stood together before the factory after Ellen had entered. Andrew had started when he had seen his wife. "You here?" he said. "I rather guess I'm here," returned Fanny. "Do you suppose I was going to stay at home and not know whether you and her were shot dead or not?" "I guess it's all safe now," said Andrew. He was very pale. He looked at the blood-stained place where Lyman Risley had lain. "It's awful work," he said. "Who did it?" asked Fanny sharply. "I heard the shot just before I got here." "I don't know for sure, and guess it's better I don't," replied Andrew sternly. Then, all at once, as they stood there, a woman came up with a swift gliding motion and a long trail of black skirts straight to Fanny, who was the only woman there. There were still a great many of men and boys standing about. The woman, Cynthia Lennox, caught Fanny's arm with a nervous grip. Her finely cut face was very white under the nodding plumes of her black bonnet. "Is he in there?" she asked in a strained voice, pointing to the shop. Fanny stared at her. She was half dazed. She did not know whether she was referring to the wounded man or Robert. Andrew was quicker in his perceptions. "They carried him off to the hospital in the ambulance," he told her. Then he added as gently as he had been addressing Ellen, "I guess he wasn't hurt so very bad. He came to before they took him away." "You don't know anything about it," Fanny said sharply. "I heard them say something about his eyes." "His eyes!" gasped Cynthia. She held tightly to Fanny, who looked at her with sudden passion of sympathy breaking through her curiosity. "Oh, I guess he wasn't hurt so very bad. He did come to. I heard him speak," she said soothingly. She laid her hard hand over Cynthia's slim one. "They took him to the hospital?" "Yes, in an ambulance." "Is my nephew in there?" "No, he went with him." Cynthia looked at the other woman with an expression of utter anguish and pleading. "Look here," said Fanny, "the hospital ain't very far from here. Suppose we go up and ask how he is. We could call out your nephew." "Will you go with me?" asked Cynthia with a heart-breaking gasp. If Ellen could have seen her at that moment, she would have recognized her as the woman whom she had known in her childhood. She was an utter surprise to Fanny, but her sympathy leaped to meet her need like the steel to magnet. "Of course I will," she said heartily. "I would," said Andrew. "I would go with her, Fanny." "Of course I will," said Fanny. "And you had better go home, I guess, Andrew, and see how I left the kitchen fire. I don't know, but the dampers are all wide open." Fanny and Cynthia hastened in one direction towards the hospital and Andrew towards home, but he paused for a minute and looked thoughtfully up at the humming pile of Lloydses. The battle was over and the strike had ended. He drew a great sigh and went home to see to the kitchen fire. End of chapter 57.
Chapter 58 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Chapter 58. Lyman Risley was very seriously injured. There was, as the men had reported, danger for his eyes. When Robert was called into the reception room of the hospital to see his aunt, he scarcely recognized her. Her soft white hair was tossed about her temples, her cheeks were burning. She ran up to him like an eager child and clutched his arm. "How is he?" she demanded. "Tell me quick." "They are doing everything they can for him." "Why, don't, poor Aunt Cynthia." "His eyes, they said—" "I hope he will come out all right." "Don't, dear Aunt Cynthia." The young man put his arm around his aunt and spoke soothingly, blushing like a girl before this sudden revelation of an understratum of delicacy in a woman's heart. Cynthia lost control of herself completely, or rather, the true self of her rose uppermost, shattering the surface ice of her reserve. "Oh," she said, "oh, if he is blind, if he is, I will lead him everywhere all the rest of his life. I will, Robert." "Of course you will, dear Aunt Cynthia," replied Robert soothingly. Suddenly Cynthia's face took on a new expression. She looked at Robert, deadly pale, and her jaw dropped. "He will not die," she said with stiff lips. "It is not as bad as that." "Oh, no, no, I am sure he will not," Robert cried, wonderingly and pityingly. "Don't, Aunt Cynthia." "If he dies," she said, "if he dies, and he has loved me all this time, and I have never done anything for him, I cannot bear it. I will not bear it. I will not, Robert." "Oh, he isn't going to die, Aunt Cynthia." "I want to go to him," she said. "I will go to him." Robert looked helplessly from her to Fanny. "I am afraid you can't just now, Aunt Cynthia," he replied. Fanny came resolutely to his assistance. "Of course you can't, Miss Lennox," she said. "The doctors won't let you see him now. You would do him more harm than good. You don't want to do him harm." "No, I don't want to do him harm," returned Cynthia in a wailing, hysterical voice. She threw herself down upon a sofa and began sobbing like a child, with her face hidden. A young doctor entered and stood looking at her. Robert turned to him. "It is my aunt, and she is agitated over Mr. Risley's accident," he said, coloring a little. Instantly the young physician's face lost its expression of astonishment and assumed the soothing gloss of his profession. "Oh, my dear Miss Lennox," he said, "there is no cause for agitation. I assure you, everything is being done for Mr. Risley." "Will he be blind?" gasped Cynthia, with a great vehemence of woe which seemed to gainsay the fact of her years. It seemed as if such an outburst of emotion could come only from a child all unacquainted with grief and unable to control it. The young doctor laughed blandly. "Blind? No, indeed," he replied. "He might have been blind had this happened 25 years ago, but with the resources of the present day it is a different matter. Pray don't alarm yourself, dear Miss Lennox." "Can you call a carriage for my aunt?" asked Robert. He went close to Cynthia and laid a hand on her slender shoulder. "I am going to have a carriage come for you, and perhaps Mrs. Brewster will be willing to go home with you in it." "Of course I will," replied Fanny. "You hear what Dr. Payson says, that there is nothing to be alarmed about," Robert said in a low voice, with his lips close to his aunt's ear. Cynthia made no resistance, but when the carriage arrived, and she was being driven off, with Fanny by her side, She called out of the window with a fierce shamelessness of anxiety. "Robert, you must come and tell me how he is this afternoon, or I shall come back here and see him myself." "Yes, I will, Aunt Cynthia," he replied, soothingly. He met the doctor's curious eyes when he turned. The young man had a gossipy mind, but he forbore to say what he thought, which was to the effect that, why, under the heavens, if that woman cared as much as that for that man, she had not married him, instead of letting him dangle after so many years. But he merely said, "There is no use in saying anything to excite a woman further when she is in such a state of mind, but—" Then he paused significantly. "You think the chances of his keeping his eyesight are poor?" said Robert. "Mighty poor," replied the doctor. Robert stood still, with his pale, shocked face bent upon the carpet. He could not seem to comprehend at once the enormity of it all. His mind was grasping at and trying to assimilate the horrible fact with an infinite pain. "Have they got the man that did it?" asked the doctor. "I don't know. I had to see to poor Risley," replied Robert. "I hope to God they have." Then all at once he thought, with keen anxiety, of Ellen. Who knew what new tragedy had happened? "I must go back to the factory," he said, hurriedly. "I will be back here in an hour or so, and see how he is getting on. For heaven's sake, do all you can." Robert was desperately impatient to be back at the factory. He was full of vague anxiety about Ellen. He could not forget that the shot which had hit poor Risley had been meant for her, and he remembered the look on the man's face as he aimed. He found a carriage at the street corner and jumped in, and bade the man drive fast. When Robert entered the great building and felt the old vibration of machinery, he had a curious sensation, one of which he had never before had and which he had not expected. For the first time in his life he knew what it was to have a complete triumph of his own will over his fellow men. He had gotten his own way. All this army of workmen, all this machinery of labor was set in motion at his desire, in opposition to their own. He realized himself a leader and a conqueror. He went into the office, and Flynn and Dennison came forward, smiling, to greet him. "Well," said Dennison, "we're off again." He spoke as if the factory were a ship which had been launched from a shoal. "Yes," replied Robert, gravely. Nellie Stone at the desk was glancing around, with a half shy, half coquettish look. "How is Mr. Risley?" asked Flynn. "He is badly hurt," replied Robert. "Have they found the man? Do you know what has been done about it?" "They've got all the police force of the city out," replied Flynn, "but it's no use. They'll never catch Amos Lee. His mother was a gypsy, I've always heard. He knows about 1,000 ways out of traps, and there's plenty to help him. They've got Dixon under arrest and Tom Peel, but they didn't have any firearms on 'em, and they can't prove anything. Peel says he's ready to go back to work." Flynn had a somewhat seedy and downcast appearance, although he fought hard for his old jaunty manner. His impulsive good nature had gotten the better of his judgment and his own wishes, and he had gone to Mamie Brady and offered to marry her out of hand if she recovered from her attempted suicide. The night before he had watched, turn and turn about, with her mother. He gave a curious effect of shamefaced and melancholy virtue. He followed Robert to one side when he was hanging up his hat and coat. "I'm going to tell you, Mr. Lloyd," he said, rather awkwardly. "Maybe you won't be interested in the midst of all this, but it all came from the strike. She's better this morning, and I'm going to marry her, poor girl." Robert looked at him in a dazed fashion. For a moment he had not the slightest idea what he was talking about. "I'm going to marry Mamie Brady," explained Flynn. "She took laudanum. It all happened on account of the strike. I'll own I'd been flirting some with her, but she'd never done it if she hadn't been out of work, too. She said so. Her mother made her life a hell. I'm going to marry her and take her out of it." "It's mighty good of you," Robert said, rather stupidly. "There ain't no other way for me to do. replied Flynn. "She thinks the world of me, and I suppose I'm to blame." "I hope she'll make you a good wife and you'll be happy," said Robert. "She thinks all creation of me," replied Flynn, with the simplest vanity and acquiescence in the responsibility laid upon him in the world. "That shot wasn't meant for Mr. Risley," said Flynn, as Robert approached the office door. His eyes flashed. He himself would gladly have been shot for the sake of Ellen Brewster. He was going to marry and try to fulfill his simple code of honor, but all his life he would be married to one woman, with another ideal in his heart. That was inevitable. "I know it wasn't," Robert replied, grimly. "Everything is quiet now," said Dennison, with his smooth smile. Robert made no reply, but entered the great workroom. "He's mighty standoffish, now he's got his own way," Dennison remarked in a whisper to Nellie Stone. He leaned closely over her. Flynn had followed Robert. The girl glanced up at the foreman, who was unmarried, although years older than she, and her face quivered a little, but it seemed due to a surface sensitiveness. "I want to know if you've heard that Ed is going to marry Mamie Brady after all," she whispered. Dennison nodded. She knitted her forehead over a column of figures. Dennison leaned his face so close that his blond bearded cheek touched hers. She made a little impatient motion. "Oh, go 'long, Jim Dennison," she said, but her tone was half-hearted. Dennison persisted, bending her head gently backward until he kissed her. She pushed him away, but she smiled weakly. "You didn't want Ed Flynn. Why, he's a Roman Catholic, and you're Baptist, Nell," he said. "Who said I did?" she retorted angrily. "Why, I wouldn't marry Ed Flynn if he was the last man in the world." "You'd 'nough sight better marry me," said Dennison. "Go 'long, you're foolin'." "No, I ain't. I mean it, honest." "I don't want to marry anybody yet awhile," said Nellie Stone, but when Dennison kissed her again she did not repulse him, and even nestled her head with a little caressing motion into the hollow of his shoulder. Then they both started violently apart as Flynn entered. "Say," he proclaimed, "what do you think? The boss has just told the hands that he'll split the difference and reduce the wages 5 instead of 10%." End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Chapter 59. When Robert Lloyd entered the factory that morning, he experienced one of those revulsions which come to man in common with all creation. As the wind can swerve from south to east and its swerving be a part of the universal scheme of things, so the inconsistency of a human soul can be an integral part of its consistency. Robert, entering Lloyd's, flushed with triumph over his workmen, filled also with rage whenever he thought of poor Risley, became suddenly, to all appearances, another man. However, he was the same man, only he had come under some hidden law of growth. All at once, as he stood there amidst those whirring and clamping machines, and surveyed those bowed and patient backs and swaying arms of labor, standing aside to allow a man bending before a heavy rack of boots to push it to another department, he realized that his triumph was gone. Not a man or woman in the factory looked at him. All continued working with a sort of patient fierceness, as if storming a citadel, as indeed they were in one sense, and waging incessant and, in the end, hopeless warfare against the destructive forces of life. Robert stood in the midst of them, these fellow beings who had bowed to his will, and saw, as if by some divine revelation, in his foes his brothers and sisters. He saw Ellen's fair head before her machine, and she seemed the keynote of a heart-breaking yet ineffable harmony of creation, which he heard for the first time. He was a man whom triumph did not exalt as much as it humiliated. Who was he to make these men and women do his bidding? They were working as hard as they had worked for full pay. Without doubt he would not gain as much comparatively, but he was going to lose nothing actually, and he would not work as these men worked. He saw himself as he never could have seen himself had the strike continued, and yet, after all, he was not a woman, to be carried away by a sudden wave of generous sentiment and enthusiasm, for his business instincts were too strong, inherited and developed by the force of example. He could not forget that this had been his uncle's factory. He shut his mouth hard and stood looking at the scene of toil. Then he resolved what to do. He spoke to Flynn, who could not believe his ears, and asked him over. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said. "Go and speak to the engineer, and tell him to shut down," said Robert. "You ain't going to turn them out after all?" gasped Flynn. He was deadly white. "No, I am not. I only want to speak to them," replied Robert shortly. When the roar of machinery had ceased, Robert stood before the employees. His faces had taken on an expression of murder and menace. They anticipated the worst by this order. "I want to say to you all," said Robert, in a loud, clear voice, "that I realize it will be hard for you to make both ends meet with a cut of 10%. I will make it 5 instead of 10%, although I shall actually lose by so doing unless business improves. I will, however, try it as long as possible. If the hard times continue, and it becomes a sheer impossibility for me to employ you on these terms without abandoning the plant altogether, I will approach you again, and trust that you will support me in any measures I am forced to take. And, on the contrary, should business improve, I promise that your wages shall be raised to the former standard at once." The speech was so straightforward that it sounded almost boyish. Robert, indeed, looked very young as he stood there, for a generous and pitying impulse does tend to make a child of a man. The workmen stared at him a minute. Then there was a queer little broken chorus of "thankies," with 2 or 3 shrill crows of cheers. Robert went from room to room, repeating his short speech. Then work recommenced. "He's the right sort after all," said Granville Joy to John Sargent, and his tone had a quality of heroism in it. He was very thin and pale. He had suffered privations, and now came additional worry of mind. He could not help thinking that this might bring about an understanding between Robert and Ellen, and yet he paid his spiritual dues at any cost. "It's no more than he ought to do," growled a man at Granville's right. "Suppose he does lose a little money." "It ain't many out of the New Testament that are going to lose a little for the sake of their fellow men, I can tell you that," said John Sargent. He was cutting away deftly and swiftly, and thinking with satisfaction of the money which he would be able to send his sister, and also how the Atkins family would be no longer so pinched. He was a man who would never come under the grindstone of the pessimism of life for his own necessities, but lately the necessities of others had almost forced him there. Now and then he glanced across the room at Maria, whose narrow shoulders he could see bent painfully over her work. He was in love with Maria, but no one suspected it, least of all Maria herself. "Lord, don't talk about the New Testament. Them days is past," growled the man on the other side of Joy. "They ain't past for me," said John Sargent stoutly. A dark flush rose to his cheek as if he were making a confession of love. "Lord, don't preach," said the other man, with a sneer. Ellen had stopped work with the rest when Robert addressed them. Then she recommenced her stitching without a word. Her thoughts were in confusion. She had so long held one attitude towards him that she could not readily adjust herself to another. She was cramped with the extreme narrowness of the enthusiasm of youth. At noontime she heard all the talk which went on about him. She heard some praise him, and some speak of him as simply doing his manifest duty, and some say openly that he should have put the wages back upon the former footing, and she did not know which was right. He did not come near her, and she was very glad of that. She felt that she could not bear it to have him speak to her before them all. When she went home at night, the news had preceded her. Fanny and Andrew looked up eagerly when she entered. "I hear he has compromised," said Andrew, with doubtful eyes on the girl's face. "Yes, he has cut the wages 5 instead of 10%," replied Ellen, and it was impossible to judge of her feelings by her voice. She took off her hat and smoothed her hair. "Well, I am glad he has done that much," said Fanny, "but I won't say a word as long as you ain't hurt." With that she went into the kitchen, and Ellen and Andrew heard the dishes rattle. "Your mother's been dreadful nervous," whispered Andrew. He looked at Ellen meaningly. Both of them thought of poor Eva Tenny. Lately the reports with regard to her had been more encouraging, but she was still in the asylum. Suddenly, as they stood there, a swift shadow passed the window, and they heard a shrill scream from upstairs. It sounded like "Mamma! Mamma!" "It's Amabel!" cried Ellen. She clutched her father by the arm. "Oh, what is it? Who is it?" she whispered fearfully. Andrew was suddenly white and horror stricken. He took hold of Ellen and pushed her forcibly before him into the parlor. "You stay in there till I call you," he said, in a commanding voice, the like of which the girl had never heard from him before. Then he shut the door, and she heard the key turn in the lock. "Father, I can't stay in here," cried Ellen. She ran towards the other door into the front hall, but before she could reach it she heard the key turn in that also. Andrew was convinced that Eva had escaped from the asylum, and thus made sure of Ellen's safety in case she was violent. Then he rushed out into the kitchen, and there was Amabel clinging to her mother like a little wild thing, and Fanny weeping aloud. When Andrew entered, Fanny flew to him. "Oh, Andrew! Oh, Andrew!" she cried. "Eva's come out. She's well. She's cured. She's as well as anybody. She is. She says so, and I know she is. Only look at her." "Mamma, mamma!" gasped Amabel, in a strange, little pent voice, which did not sound like a child's. There was something fairly inhuman about it. "Mamma," as she said it, did not sound like a word in any known language. It was a cry of universal childhood for its parent. Amabel clung to her mother, not only with her slender little arms, but with her legs and breast and neck. All her slim body became as a vine with tendrils of love and growth around her mother. As for Eva, she could not have enough of her. She was intoxicated with the possession of this little creature of her own flesh and blood. "She's grown so tall," she said, in a high, panting voice. It was all she could seem to realize, the fact that the child had grown so tall, and it filled her at once with ineffable pain and delight. She held the little thing so close to her that the two seemed fairly one. "Mamma, mamma!" said Amabel again. "She has grown so tall," panted Eva. Fanny went up to her and tried gently to loosen her grasp on the little girl. In her heart she was not yet quite sure of her. This fierceness of delight began to alarm her. "Of course she has grown tall, Eva Tenny," she said. "It's quite a while since you were taken sick." "I ain't sick now," said Eva, in a steady voice. "I'm cured now. The doctors say so. You needn't be afraid, Fanny Brewster." "Mamma, mamma!" said Amabel. Eva bent down and kissed the little delicate face. Then she looked at her sister and at Andrew, and her own countenance seemed fairly illuminated. "I ain't told you all," said she. Then she stopped and hesitated. "What is it, Eva?" asked Fanny, looking at her with increasing courage. The tears were streaming openly down her cheeks. "Oh, you poor girl, what have you been through?" she said. "What is it?" "I ain't got to go through anything any more," said Eva, still with that rapt look over Amabel's little fair head. "He's come back." "Eva Tenny!" "Yes, he has," Eva went on, with such an air of inexpressible triumph that it had almost a religious quality in it. "He has. He'd left her a long time ago. He wanted to come back to me and Amabel, but he was ashamed. But finally he came to the asylum and then it all rolled off. All the trouble. The doctors said I had been getting better, but they didn't know. It was Jim's coming back. He's took me home, and I've come for Amabel, and he's got a job in Lloyd's, and he's bought me this new hat and cape." Eva flirted her free arm, and a sweep of jetted silk gleamed. Then she tossed her head consciously to display a hat with a knot of pink roses. Then she kissed Amabel again. "Mamma's come back," she whispered. "Mamma, mamma!" cried Amabel. Andrew and Fanny looked at each other. "Where is he?" asked Andrew in a slow, halting voice. Eva glanced from one to the other defiantly. "He's outside, waiting in the road," said she, "but he ain't coming in unless you treat him just the same as ever. I've set my veto on that." Eva's voice and manner, as she said that, were so unmistakably her own that all Fanny's doubt of her sanity vanished. She sobbed aloud. "Oh, God, I'm so thankful! She's come home, and she's all right. Oh, God, I'm so thankful!" "What about Jim?" asked Eva, with her old, proud, defiant look. "Of course he's coming in," sobbed Fanny. "Andrew, you go." But Andrew had already gone, unlocking the parlor door on his way. "It's your Aunt Eva, Ellen," he said as he passed. "She's come home cured, and your Uncle Jim is out in the yard, and I'm going to call him in. I guess you better go out and see her." End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Chapter 60. Lloyd's had been running for 2 months, and spring had fairly begun. It was a very forward season. The elms were leafed out, the cherry and peach blossoms had fallen, and the apple trees were in full flower. There were so many orchards around Rowe. The little city was surrounded with bowing garlands of tenderest white and rose. The well-kept lawns in the city limits were like velvet, and golden spiked bushes and pink trails of flowering almond were beside the gates. Lilacs, also, flushed with rose, purpled the walls of old houses. One morning, Ellen, on her way to the factory, had for the first time that year a realization of the full presence of the spring. All at once she knew the goddess to be there in her full glory. "Spring has really come," she said to Abby. As she spoke, she jostled a great bush of white flowers, growing in a yard close to the sidewalk, and an overpowering fragrance, like a very retaliation of sweetness, came in her face. "Yes," said Abby, "it seems more like spring than it did last night, somehow." Abby had gained flesh, and there was a soft color on her cheeks, so that she was almost pretty. As she glanced abroad with a sort of bright gladness and a face ready with smiles. Maria also looked in better health than she had done in the winter. She walked with her arm through Ellen's. Suddenly a carriage, driven rapidly, passed them, and Cynthia Lennox's graceful profile showed like a drooping white flower in a window. Sadie Peel came up to them with a swift run. "Say," she said, "know who that was?" "We've got eyes," replied Abby Atkins shortly. "Who said you hadn't? You needn't be so up and comin', Abby Atkins. I didn't know as you knew they were married, that's all. I've just heard it from Lottie Snell, whose sister works at the dressmaker's that made the wedding fix." "Wedding fix! My land, think of a wedding without a white dress and a veil. All she had was a gray silk and a black velvet and a black lace and a travelling dress." Abby Atkins eyed the other girl sharply, her curiosity getting the better of her dislike. "Who did she marry?" said she, shortly. "I suppose she didn't marry the black velvet, or the lace, or the travelling dress. That's all you seem to think about." "I thought you didn't know," replied Sadie Peel, in a tone of triumph. "They've kept it mighty still, and he's been going there so long, ever since anybody can remember, that they didn't think it was anything more now than it had been right along. Lyman Risley and Cynthia Lennox have just got married, and they've gone down to Old Point Comfort. My land, it's nice to have money, if you be half blind." Ellen looked after the retreating carriage and made no comment. She was pale and thin, and moved with a certain languor, although she held up her head proudly, and when people asked if she were not well, answered quickly that she had never been better. Robert had not been to see her yet. She had furtively watched for him a long time, then she had given it up. She would not acknowledge to herself or any one else that she was not well or was troubled in spirit. Her courage was quite equal to the demand upon it, yet always she was aware of a peculiar sensitiveness to all happenings, whether directly concerned with herself or not, which made life an agony to her, and she knew that her physical strength was not what it had been. Only that morning she had looked at her face in the glass, and had seen how it was altered. The lovely color was gone from her cheeks. There were little faint downward lines about her mouth, and, more than that, out of her blue eyes looked the eternal, unanswerable question of humanity: where is my happiness? It seemed to her when she first set out that she could not walk to the factory. That sense of the full presence of the spring seemed to overpower her. All the revelation of beauty and sweetness seemed a refinement of torture worse to bear than the sight of death and misery would have been. Every blooming apple bough seemed to strike her full on the heart. "Only look at that bush of red flowers in that yard," Maria said once, and Ellen looked, and was stung by the sight as by the contact of a red flaming torch of spring. "What ails you, dear? Don't you like those flowers?" Maria said anxiously. "Yes, of course I do. I think they are lovely," replied Ellen, looking. She looked after the carriage which contained the bridal party. She thought how the bridegroom had almost lost his eyesight to save her, and her old adoration of Cynthia seemed to rise to a flood tide. Then came the thought of Robert, how he must have ceased to love her, how, some day, he would be starting off on a bridal trip of his own. Maud Hemingway, with whom she had often coupled him in her thoughts, seemed to start up before her, all dressed in bridal white. It seemed to her that she could not bear it all. She continued walking, but she did not feel the ground beneath her feet, nor even Maria's little clinging fingers of tenderness on her arm. She became to her own understanding like an instrument which is played upon with such results of harmonies and discords that all sense of the mechanism is lost. "Well, Ellen Brewster," said Sadie Peel, in her loud, strident voice, "I guess you wouldn't have been walking along here quite so fine this morning if it hadn't been for Mr. Risley. You'd ought to send him a wedding present, a spoon or something." "Shut up," said Abby Atkins. "Ellen has worried herself sick over him as it is." She eyed Ellen anxiously as she spoke. Maria clung more closely to her. "Shut up yourself, Abby Atkins," returned Sadie Peel. "He's got a wife to lead him around, and I don't see much to worry about. A great wedding! My goodness, if I don't get married when I'm young enough to wear a white dress and veil, catch me getting married at all." Sadie Peel sped on with her news to a group of girls ahead, and the wheels of the carriage flashed out of sight in the spring sunlight. It was quite true that Risley and Cynthia had been married that morning. He had not entirely lost his vision, although it would always be poor, and he would live happily, although in a measure disappointedly, feeling that his partial helplessness was his chief claim upon his wife's affection. He had gotten what he had longed for so many years, but by means which tended to his humiliation instead of his pride. But Cynthia was radiant. In caring for her half-blind husband, she attained the spiritual mountain height of her life. She possessed love in the one guise in which he appealed to her, and she held him fast to the illumination of her very soul. After the carriage had passed out of sight, Abby came close on the other side of Ellen, and slid her arm through hers. "Say," she began. "What is it?" asked Ellen. Abby blushed. "Oh, nothing much," she replied, in a tone unusual for her. She took her arm away from Ellen's and laughed a little foolishly. Ellen stared at her with grave wonder. She had not the least idea what she meant. Abby changed the subject. "Going to the park opening tonight, Ellen?" she asked. "No, I guess not." "You'd better go. Do go, Ellen." "Yes, do go, Ellen. It will do you good," said Maria. She looked into Ellen's face with the inexpressibly pure love of one innocent girl for another. The park was a large grove of oaks and fir trees, which had recently been purchased by the Street Railway Company of Rowe, and it was to be used for the free entertainment of the people, with an undercurrent of consideration for the financial profit of the company. "I'm afraid I can't go," said Ellen. "Yes, you can. It will do you good. You look like a ghost this morning," said Abby. "Do go, Ellen," pleaded Maria. However, Ellen would not have gone had it not been for a whisper of Abby's as they came out of the factory that night. "Look here, Ellen, you'd better go," said she, "just to show folks. That Sadie Peel asked me this noon if it was true that you had something on your mind and was worrying about, well, you know what, that made you look so." Ellen flushed an angry red. "I'll stop for you and Maria tonight," she answered quickly. "All right," Abby replied, heartily. "We'll go on the 8 o'clock car." Ellen hurried home and changed her dress after supper, putting on her new green silk waist and her spring hat, which was trimmed with roses. When she went downstairs and told her mother where she was going, she started up. "I declare, I'd go too if your father had come home," she said. "I don't know when I've been anywhere. And Eva was in this afternoon and said she and Jim were going." "I wonder where father is," said Ellen uneasily. "I don't know as I ought to go till he comes home." "Oh, stuff!" replied Fanny. "He's stopped to talk at the store. Oh, here he is now. Andrew Brewster, where in the world have you been?" she began as he entered, but his mother was following him, and something in their faces stopped her. Fanny Brewster had lived for years with this man, but never before had she seen his face with just that expression of utter, unreserved joy, although joy was scarcely the word for it was more than that. It was the look of a man who has advanced to his true measure of growth, and regained self-respect which he had lost. All the abject bend of his aging back, all the apologetic patience of his outlook, was gone. She stared at him, hardly believing her eyes. She was as frightened as if he had looked despairing instead of joyful. "Andrew Brewster, what is it?" she asked. She tried to smile, to echo the foolish width of grimace on his face, but her lips were too stiff. Ellen looked at him, trembling, and very white under her knot of roses. Andrew held out a paper and tried to speak, but he could not. "For God's sake, what is it?" gasped Fanny. Then Mrs. Zelotes spoke. "That old mining stock has come up," said she, in a harsh voice. "He'd never ought to have bought it. I should have told him better if he had asked me, but it's come up, and it's worth considerable more than he paid for it. I've just been down to Mrs. Poindexter's, and Lawyer Sampson was in there seeing her about a bond she's got that's run out, and he says the mine's going to pay dividends, and for Andrew to hold on to part of it, anyhow. I bought this paper, and it's in it. He never ought to have bought it, but it's come up. I hope it will learn him a lesson. He's had enough trouble over it." Nothing could exceed the mixture of recrimination and exultation with which the old woman spoke. She eyed Fanny accusingly. She looked at Andrew with grudging triumph. "Lawyer Sampson says it will make him rich, he guesses. At any rate, he'll come out whole," said she. "I hope it will learn you a lesson." Andrew dropped into a chair. His face was distended with a foolish smile like a baby's. He seemed to smile at all creation. He looked at his wife and Ellen. Then his face again took on its expression of joyful vacuity. Fanny went close to him and laid a firm hand on his shoulder. "You ain't had a mite of supper, Andrew Brewster," said she. "Come right out and have something to eat." Andrew shook his head, still smiling. His wife and daughter looked at him alarmedly, then at each other. Then his mother went behind him, laid a hard old hand on each shoulder, and shook him. "If you have got a streak of luck, there's no need of your acting like a fool about it, Andrew Brewster," said she. "Go out and eat your supper, and behave yourself, and let it be a lesson to you. There you had worked and saved that little money you had in the bank, and you bought an old mine with it, and it might have turned out there wasn't a thing in it, no mine at all, and there was. Just let it be a lesson to you, that's all. And go out and eat your supper, and don't be too set up over it." Andrew looked at his wife and mother and daughter, still with that expression of joy, so unreserved that it was almost idiotic. They had all stood by him loyally. He had their fullest sympathy, but had one of them fully understood? Not one of them could certainly understand what was then passing in his mind, which had been straitened by grief and self-reproach, and was now expanding to hold its full measure of joy. That poor little sum in the bank, that accumulation of his hard earnings, which he had lost through his own bad judgment, had meant much more than itself to him, both in its loss and its recovery. It was more than money. It was the value of money in the current coin of his own self-respect. His mother shook him again, but rather gently. "Get up this minute and go out and eat your supper," said she, "and then I don't see why you can't go with Fanny and me to the park opening. They say lots of folks are going, and there's going to be fireworks. It'll distract your mind. It ain't safe for anybody to dwell too much on good luck any more than on misfortune. Go right out and eat your supper. It's most time for the car." Andrew obeyed. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Chapter 61. The new park, which had been named in honor of the president of the Street Railway Company, Clemens Park, was composed of a light growth of oak and birch trees. With the light of the full moon, like a broadside of silvery arrows, and the frequent electric lights filtering through the young, delicate foliage, it was much more effective than a grove of pine or hemlock would have been. When the people streamed into it from the crowded electric cars, there were exclamations of rapture. Women and girls fairly shrieked with delight. The ground, which had been entirely cleared of undergrowth, was like an etching, in clearest black and white, of the tender, dancing foliage of the oaks and birches. The birches stood together in leaning, white-limbed groups like maidens, and the rustling spread of the oaks shed broad flashes of silver from the moon. In the midst of the grove, the Hungarian orchestra played in a pavilion, and dancing was going on there. Many of the people outside moved with dancing steps. Children in swings flew through the airs with squeals of delight. There was a stand for the sale of ice cream and soda, and pretty girls blossomed like flowers behind the counters. There were various rustic adornments, such as seats and grottos, and at one end of the grove was a small collection of wild animals in cages, and a little artificial pond with swans. Now and then, above the chatter of the people and the music of the orchestra, sounded the growl of a bear or the shrill screech of a parakeet, and the people all stopped and listened and laughed. This little titillation of the unusual in the midst of their sober walk of life affected them like champagne. Most of them were of the poorer and middle classes, the employees of the factories of rope. They moved back and forth with dancing steps of exultation. "My, ain't it beautiful?" Fanny said, squeezing Andrew's arm. He had his wife on one arm, his mother on the other. For him the whole scene appeared more than it really was, since it reflected the joy of his own soul. There was for him a light greater than that of the moon or electricity upon it, that extreme light of the world, the happiness of a human being who blesses in a moment of prosperity the hour he was born. He knew for the first time in his life that happiness is as true as misery, and no mere creation of a fairy tale. No trees of the Garden of Eden could have outshone for him those oaks and birches. No gold or precious stones of any mines on earth can equal the light of the little star of happiness in one human soul. Fanny, as they walked along, kept looking at her husband, and her own face was transfigured. Mrs. Zelotes, also, seemed to radiate with a sort of harsh and prickly delight. She descanted upon the hard-earned savings which Andrew had risked, but she held her old head very high with a reluctant joy, and her bonnet had a rakish cant. Ellen, with Abby and Maria, walked behind them. Presently Andrew met another man who had also purchased stock in the mine, and stopped to exchange congratulations. The man's face was flushed as if he had been drinking, but he had not. On his arm hung his wife, a young woman with a showy red waist and some pink ribbon bows on her hat. She was teetering a little in time to the music, while a little girl clung to her skirts and teetered also. "Well, old man," said the newcomer, with a hoarse sound in his throat, "they needn't talk to us any more, need they?" "That's so," replied Andrew, but his joy in prosperity was not like the other man's. It placed him heights above him, although from the same cause. Prosperity means one thing to one man, and another to his brother. Presently they met Jim Tenny and Eva and Amabel. They were walking three abreast, Amabel in the middle. Jim Tenny looked hesitatingly at them, although his face was widened with irrepressible smiles. Eva gazed at them with defiant radiance. "Well," said she, "so luck has turned?" Amabel laughed out, and her laugh trilled high with a note of silver above the chatter of the crowd and the blare and rhythmic trill of the orchestra. "I've had an ice cream, and I'm going to have a new doll and a doll carriage," said she. "Oh, Ellen!" She left her father and mother for a second, and clung to Ellen, kissing her. Then she was back. "Well, Andrew?" said Jim. He had a shamed face, yet there was something brave in it, struggling for expression. "Well, Jim?" said Andrew. The two shook hands solemnly. Then they walked on together, and the sisters behind, with Amabel clinging to her mother's hand. "Jim's going to work if he has had a little windfall," said Eva, proudly. "Oh, Fanny, only think what it means." "I hope it will be a lesson to both of them," said Mrs. Zelotes, stalking along after, but she smiled harshly. "Oh, land, don't croak if you've got a chance to laugh. There's few enough chances in this world," cried Eva, with boisterous good humor. "As for me, I've come out of deep waters, and I'm going to take what comfort I can in the feel of the solid ground under my feet." She began to force Amabel into a dance in time with the music, and the child shrieked with laughter. "Suppose she's all right?" whispered Mrs. Zelotes to Fanny. "Land, yes," replied Fanny. "It's just like her, just the way she used to do. It makes me surer than anything else that she's cured." The girls behind were loitering. Abby turned to Ellen and pointed to a rustic seat under a clump of birches. "Let's sit down here a minute, Ellen," said she. "All right," replied Ellen. When she and Abby seated themselves, Maria withdrew, standing aloof under an oak, looking up at the illumined spread of branches with the rapt, innocent expression of a saint. "Why don't you come and sit down with us, Maria?" Ellen called. "In a minute," replied Maria, in her weak, sweet voice. Then John Sargent came up and joined her. "She'll come in a minute," Abby said to Ellen. She knows I want to tell you something." Abby hesitated. Ellen regarded her with wonder. "Look here, Ellen," said Abby, "I don't know what you're going to think of me after all I've said, but I'm going to get married to Willie Jones. His mother has had a little money left her, and she owns the house clear now, and I'm going to keep right on working, and I never thought I would, Ellen, you know, but I've come to think lately that all you can get out of labor in this world is the happiness it brings you, and the love. That's more than the money, and he wants me pretty bad. I suppose you think I'm awful, Ellen Brewster." Abby spoke with triumph, yet with shame. She dug her little toe into the shadow mottled ground. "Oh, Abby, I hope you'll be real happy," said Ellen. Then she choked a little. "I've made up my mind not to work for nothing," said Abby. "I've made up my mind to get whatever work is worth in this world if I can, and to get it for him, too." "I hope you will be very happy," said Ellen again. "There he is now," whispered Abby. She rose as Willie Jones approached, laughing confusedly. "I've been telling Ellen Brewster," said Abby, with her perfunctory air. Ellen held out her hand, and Willie Jones grasped it, then let it drop and muttered something. He looked with helpless adoration at Abby, who put her hand through his arm reassuringly. "Let's go and see the animals," said she. "I haven't seen the animals." "I guess I'll go and see if I can find my father and mother," returned Ellen. "I want to see my mother about something." "Oh, come with us." Abby grasped Ellen firmly around the waist and whispered. "I don't love him a mite better than I do you," she whispered. "So there. You needn't think you're left out, Ellen Brewster." "I don't," replied Ellen. She tried to laugh, but felt her lips stiff. An unconquerable feeling of desolation was coming over her, and in spite of herself, her tone was somewhat like that of a child who sees another with all the cake. "I suppose you know Floretta got married last night," said Abby, moving off with Willie Jones. John Sargent and Maria had long since disappeared from under the oak. Ellen, left alone, looked for a minute after Abby and Willie, and noted the tender lean of the girl's head towards the young man's shoulder. Then she started off to find her father and mother. She could not rid herself of the sense of desolation. She felt blindly that if she could not get under the shelter of her own loves of life, she could not bear it any longer. She had borne up bravely under Robert's neglect, but now, all at once, with the sight of the happiness of these others before her eyes, it seemed to crush her. All the spirit in her seemed to flag and faint. She was only a young girl who would fall to the ground and be slain by the awful law of gravitation of the spirit without love. "Anyway, I've got father and mother," she said to herself. She rushed on alone through the merry crowd. The orchestra was playing a medley. The violins seemed to fairly pierce thought. A Roman candle burst forth on the right with a great spluttering, and the people, shrieking with delight, rushed in that direction. Then a rocket shot high in the air with a splendid curve, and there was a sea of faces watching with speechless admiration the dropping stars of violet and gold and rose. Ellen kept on, moving as nearly as she could in the direction in which her party had gone. Then suddenly she came face to face with Robert Lloyd. She would have passed him without a word, but he stood before her. "Won't you speak to me?" he asked. "Good evening, Mr. Lloyd," returned Ellen. Then she tried to move on again, but Robert still stood before her. "I want to say something to you," he said, in a low voice. "I was coming to your house to night, but I saw you on the car. Please come to that seat over there. There is nobody in that direction. They will all go towards the fireworks now." Ellen looked at him hesitatingly. At that moment she seemed to throw out protecting antennae of maidenliness, and, besides, there was always the memory of the cut in wages, for which she still judged him, and then there was the long neglect. "Please come," said Robert. He looked at her at once like a conqueror and a pleading child. Ellen placed her hand on his arm, and they went to the seat under the clump of birches. They were quite alone, for the whole great company was streaming towards the fireworks. A fiery wheel was revolving in the distance, and rockets shot up, dropping showers of stars. Ellen gazed at them without seeing them at all. Robert, seated beside her, looked at her earnestly. "I am going to put back the wages on the old basis to morrow," he said. Ellen made no reply. "Business has so improved that I feel justified in doing so," said Robert. His tone was almost apologetic. Never as long as he lived would he be able to look at such matters from quite the same standpoint as that of the girl beside him. She knew that, and yet she loved him. She never would get his point of view, and yet he loved her. I have waited until I was able to do that before speaking to you again," said Robert. "I knew how you felt about the wage cutting. I thought when matters were back on the old basis that you might feel differently towards me. God knows I have been sorry enough for it all, and I am glad enough to be able to pay them full wages again. And now, dear?" "It has been a long time," said Ellen, looking at her little hands clasped in her lap. "I have loved you all the time, and I have only waited for that," said Robert. Later on, Robert and Ellen joined Fanny and the others. It was scarcely the place to make an announcement. After a few words of greeting, the young couple walked off together, and left the Brewsters and Tennys and Mrs. Zelotes standing on the outskirts of the crowd watching the fireworks. Granville Joy stood near them. He had looked at Robert and Ellen with a white face. Then he turned again towards the fireworks, with a gentle, heroic expression. He caught up Amabel, that she might see the set piece which was just being put up. "Now you can see, Sissy," he said. Eva looked away from the fireworks after the retreating pair, then meaningly at Fanny and Andrew. "That's settled," said she. Andrew's face quivered a little, and took on something of the same look which Granville Joy's wore. All love is at the expense of love, and calls for heroes. "It will be a great thing for her," said Fanny in his ear. "It'll be a splendid thing for her. You know that, Andrew." Andrew gazed after the nodding roses on Ellen's hat vanishing towards the right. Another rocket shot up, and the people cried out, and watched the shower of stars with breathless enjoyment. Andrew saw their upturned faces, in which for the while toil and trial were blotted out by that delight in beauty and innocent pleasure of the passing moment which is, for human souls, akin to the refreshing showers for flowers of spring. And to him, since his own vision was made clear by his happiness, came a mighty realization of it all, which was beyond it all. Another rocket described a wonderful golden curve of grace, then a red light lit all the watching people. Andrew looked for Ellen and Robert, and saw the girl's beautiful face turning backward over her lover's shoulder. All his life Andrew had been a reader of the Bible, as had his father and mother before him. To-day, ever since he had heard of his good fortune, his mind had dwelt upon certain verses of Ecclesiastes. Now he quoted from them. "Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity, which he hath given thee under the sun, all the days of thy vanity, for that is thy portion in this life and in thy labor which thou takest under the sun." Ellen saw her father, and smiled and nodded. Then she and her lover passed out of sight. Another rocket trailed its golden parabola along the sky, and dropped with stars. There was an ineffably sweet strain from the orchestra. The illuminated oaks tossed silver and golden boughs in a gust of fragrant wind. Andrew quoted again from the old King of Wisdom. "I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor," and that was my portion of labor. Then Andrew thought of the hard winter which had passed, as all hard things must pass, of the toilsome lives of those beside him, of all the work which they had done with their poor knotted hands, of the tracks which they had worn on the earth towards their graves with their weary feet, and suddenly he seemed to grasp a new and further meaning for that verse of Ecclesiastes. He seemed to see that labor is not alone for itself, not for what it accomplishes of the tasks of the world, not for its equivalent in silver and gold, not even for the end of human happiness and love, but for the growth in character of the laborer. "That is the portion of labor," he said. He spoke in a strained, solemn voice, as he had done before. Nobody heard him except his wife and mother. His mother gave a sidewise glance at him, then she folded her cape tightly around her and stared at the fireworks. But Fanny put her hand through his arm and leaned her cheek against his shoulder. End of Chapter 61. End of The Portion of Labor by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman.